Gather round, children. Gather round this old fire of memory. I's an old soul bent like the willow tree from the winds of time, carrying the iron bite of chains on my wrists, though they've been rusted away long ago. I come from the blood of them that crossed the Middle Passage, them ghost ships where the ocean swallowed screams and spit out survivors with eyes like burnt coal. I seen the auction block in my dreams, heard the crack of the gavel splitting families like dry wood, mamas wailing as they babes get dragged off to some far field. But listen here now, 'cause I's gonna tell you a tale that's been whispered through the cotton rows and the tobacco barns of old Virginia. It ain't just a story, it's a living wound, a promise of fire in the dark. Come sit by me and hear about Harriet of the Surgeries, the black woman who bore 550 knives without a drop of mercy, and in her rage, poisoned the whole damn farm that broke her. Now you see, people, it all started under a cursed sky, down in the belly of Virginia, round the year 1820, when the land was fat with stolen sweat and the river ran red with the mud of toil. Harriet come into this world on the Blackwell plantation, a sprawling beast of a place near Richmond, where the James River whispered secrets that the white folks didn't want told. Her mama, they called her Nettie, had hands worn smooth from scrubbing floors in the big house till her knees bled prayers into the wooden planks. Her daddy, Big Samuel, was a field hand, strong-backed man with shoulders like iron, but his back was a map of scars, each line a story of the overseer's lash. The night Harriet was born, old folks say the moon hid behind clouds thick as conjure smoke, and the quarters went quiet as a grave. Nettie labored in a cabin with walls that leaked rain and hope. Nothing but a dirt floor beneath her, and a midwife woman named Aunt Zara who knew the old ways, the African ways. Aunt Zara whispered prayers in a tongue the masters forbade, burning sweet grass and muttering protection over the child. "This one," she said, her voice heavy with knowing, "this one carry fire in her blood. She gon' suffer something terrible, but she gon' burn bright too." Lord have mercy, them words hung in the air like smoke from a haint's breath. When Harriet finally came into this world, she didn't cry soft like other babies. She screamed, loud and fierce, like she already knew what awaited her. Nettie held her close, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "I name you after the Moses of our people, Harriet. May you walk in her footsteps, child, and find your way to freedom." But freedom was a dream distant as the North Star in them days. The Blackwell plantation stretched endless, tobacco leaves swaying like green ghosts in the Virginia heat, and the slave quarters, Lord, the quarters, were shacks of misery, wood and clay pressed together by hands that built their own prisons. Harriet grew up knowing the smell of fear and sweat, the sound of chains rattling in the dark, the sight of her daddy coming home from the fields with his back split open, blood soaking through his shirt like bitter rain. Master Blackwell was a cruel one, fat and red-faced, with a Bible in one hand and a whip in the other. He preached about God's order on Sundays, standing in that white church with its stained glass windows. Then come Monday, he'd be in the fields watching the overseer, a man named Taggart, mean as a copperhead and twice as quick to strike, drive the slaves till they dropped. Taggart had eyes like cold iron and a laugh that made your soul shiver. He took pleasure in breaking spirits, in watching folks suffer something terrible. The big house stood proud on a hill, all white columns and lace curtains hiding the rot inside. Mistress Blackwell was a delicate thing, always fanning herself and complaining about the heat, never minding that down in the quarters, children went hungry and mothers cried themselves to sleep. She had a voice sweet as honey but a heart hard as stone. Nettie worked under her hand, cleaning, cooking, nursing white babies, while her own child grew up in the shadows. Harriet's first memories were of hunger and heat. She remembered sitting on the dirt floor of their cabin, watching her mama cook whatever scraps they had. Cornmeal mush, sometimes a bit of salted pork if the master felt generous. She remembered the songs her mama sang, low and mournful. Songs from Africa passed down through generations. Songs that spoke of rivers and homelands lost forever. Nettie would hold her close and whisper stories of their people, of kings and queens across the ocean, of ancestors who walked proud before the chains came. "We was somebody, baby," Nettie would say, her voice thick with longing. "We come from greatness, even if these white folks try to make us forget. Big Samuel would come home bone-tired, his hands cracked and bleeding from the tobacco plants, and he'd look at his daughter with eyes full of love and sorrow. He taught her to be strong, to hold her head up even when the world tried to beat her down. "You a fighter, Harriet," he'd say. "I see it in you. Don't never let 'em break that spirit." But the world had other plans. By the time Harriet was 5, she'd already seen things no child should see. She watched as families got torn apart on the auction block in Richmond, mamas screaming as their babies got sold away, husbands and wives separated forever. She heard the crack of the whip echoing through the plantation, saw grown men reduced to weeping wrecks. She learned early that black pain didn't count for nothing in this world the white folks built. The quarters were a world unto themselves, a place where folks tried to hold on to humanity in the face of endless cruelty. At night, after the work was done and the overseers had gone to bed, the enslaved would gather in secret, singing spirituals that carried coded messages. Wade in the water meant watch for the paddy rollers. Swing low, sweet chariot spoke of escape and the Underground Railroad. Harriet would sit at her mama's feet, absorbing every word, every note, storing them in her heart like treasures. There was an old man in the quarters named Uncle Josiah, different from the Josiah who'd come later in her life, who knew root work and conjure. He'd sit by the fire on cold nights, telling stories of haints and spirits, of the power that lived in the crossroads and the protection that came from goofer dust and mojo bags. "The ancestors watchin'," he'd say, his voice crackling like dry leaves. "They see everything, and one day they gon' call for justice." Harriet listened, wide-eyed, as he spoke of women who could curse their masters with a single word, of men who walked through fire and came out whole. She learned about the root doctors who could heal with herbs and harm with poisons, about the conjure women who held power that the white folks feared but couldn't understand. This knowledge settled deep in her bones, waiting for the day it would be needed. When Harriet turned 7, the overseer came for her. Taggart stood in the doorway of their cabin one morning, blocking out the sun like a bad omen, and said, "This one's old enough. Get her in the fields." Nettie's cry cut through the air like a knife. "Please, Massa Taggart, she just a child." But Taggart just laughed, that cruel sound that haunted nightmares. "Old enough to work, master's orders." Big Samuel's fists clenched at his sides, his whole body trembling with rage he couldn't act on. To strike an overseer meant death, slow death, the kind where they'd hang you from the oak tree as a lesson to all the others. So he stood there, helpless, watching as his baby girl got dragged into a life of suffering. That first day in the fields, under the burning sun that showed no mercy, Harriet learned what it meant to be a slave. Her small hands bled from the tobacco leaves, her back ached from bending over rows that stretched to the horizon. The other field hands tried to help her. A woman named Bessie who'd later become like a sister, a man named Rufus who snuck her water when Taggart wasn't looking. But there was only so much they could do. The sun beat down like God's own fury, and the work never stopped. "Keep moving, girl," Taggart would shout, cracking his whip in the air just to hear folks jump. "You slow down, you feel leather." Harriet kept her head down, kept her hands moving. But inside her, something was growing. Not fear. No, fear was there too, but beneath it was a fire, a stubbornness that refused to be extinguished. She remembered her daddy's words, "You a fighter." She remembered Aunt Zara's prophecy, "She gon' burn bright." As the months turned to years, Harriet grew tall and strong, her skin dark as polished ebony, her eyes holding a depth that unsettled the white folks. She had her mama's grace and her daddy's strength, but she had something else too, a spirit that wouldn't bow, a mind that kept reaching for more. At night, when everyone else slept, she'd sneak to the edge of the plantation where an old slave named Abraham had taught himself to read from stolen newspapers. Abraham was half blind and ancient, but he had wisdom in him like a deep well. "Knowledge is power, child," he'd whisper, showing her letters by moonlight. "They don't want us to have it 'cause they know what we could do with it." Harriet learned her letters in secret, sounding out words in the dark, dreaming of a world beyond the plantation. She read about places called Philadelphia and Boston, about something called abolition, about a woman named Harriet Tubman who was leading folks to freedom. The words filled her with longing so sharp it hurt worse than the overseer's whip. By the time she was 12, Harriet had blossomed into a young woman. She moved through the plantation with a quiet dignity that drew eyes, both black and white. The enslaved folks respected her, saw in her a leader in the making. But the white folks, they saw something else. Taggart started watching her with eyes that made her skin crawl, and more than once she had to dodge his reaching hands in the shadows. "You stay clear of that man," Bessie warned her. "He got a taste for young girls, and ain't nothing we can do to stop him if he set his mind to it." But Harriet was clever. She learned to move like smoke, to disappear when danger came close. She kept a sharp piece of flint hidden in her dress, and she'd sworn to herself that before she let any man violate her, she'd cut him first and take whatever punishment came. The years passed in a blur of endless labor and stolen moments of humanity. Harriet sang spirituals in the fields, her voice rising above the others, strong and pure. She tended to the sick when she could, using herbs and remedies Aunt Zara had taught her. She became a pillar of the quarters, someone folks turned to when times got harder than usual. And times were always hard. She watched as her younger brother got sold away when he was only 8, torn from Nettie's arms and carried off to a plantation in Georgia. She watched as Big Samuel's spirit slowly broke under years of brutality, his shoulders bending under invisible weight. She watched as friends disappeared, some sold, some dead from overwork, some who tried to run and got caught, brought back bloody and broken to be made examples of. Through it all, Harriet kept that fire burning. She dreamed of freedom, yes, but more than that, she dreamed of justice. She looked at the big house on the hill and wondered what it would take to bring it down. She looked at Taggart's smiling face and imagined wiping that smile away forever. She looked at her scarred, exhausted people and vowed that somehow, someday, things would be different. Then, when Harriet was 15, everything changed. A young man came to the plantation, a blacksmith from a nearby farm, hired to fix the tools and shoe the horses. His name was Josiah, and the first time Harriet saw him, her heart did something strange, something she'd never felt before. He was tall and powerfully built, with hands strong as hammers and eyes that held both gentleness and fire. He moved with a quiet confidence, and when he smiled at her across the forge, Harriet felt like the sun had come out after a lifetime of rain. "What's your name, sister?" he asked, his voice deep and warm. "Harriet," she managed to say, suddenly shy in a way she'd never been before. "Harriet," he repeated like he was tasting the word. "That's a strong name, name of a warrior." They began to steal moments together, brief conversations by the well, shared glances across the yard, walks in the twilight when the overseers weren't watching too close. Josiah told her about his dreams of freedom, about the Underground Railroad he'd heard whispers of, about a place called Canada where black folks could live free. "One day," he promised, holding her hand in the darkness, "one day we gon' get out of here. You and me, Harriet. We gon' see that North Star and follow it home." Harriet let herself believe it. For the first time in her life, she let herself hope for something more than mere survival. Josiah made her laugh, made her feel human again, made her remember that even in bondage, love could bloom like a flower in cracked earth. They courted in secret, stealing kisses behind the smokehouse, dreaming out loud about the life they'd build when they were free. Josiah taught her about resistance, not just running, but the small acts of rebellion that kept the spirit alive. He showed her how to break tools in ways that looked accidental, how to work slow without getting caught, how to sabotage the master's crops just enough to hurt his profits without bringing down punishment. "Resistance ain't always about fighting head-on," he said. "Sometimes it's about undermining them, bit by bit, till the whole rotten structure falls apart." As the seasons turned and Harriet's love for Josiah deepened, she began to dream of a future. Maybe, just maybe, they could save enough to buy their freedom. Maybe they could escape together, find their way north, start a family in a place where their children wouldn't be born into chains. The dream was fragile as spun glass, but it was hers, and she held it close to her heart. Then came the night that changed everything. Harriet was 17. and she and Josiah had been sneaking around for near 2 years. They'd been careful, so careful, but love makes you reckless. They met in the old tobacco barn, wrapped in each other's arms, whispering promises under the rafters. And in that moment of stolen joy, life took root. Harriet knew it almost immediately. That strange flutter in her belly, the way her body felt different, the morning sickness that came like clockwork. She was carrying Josiah's child, and despite all the fear and uncertainty, she felt a joy so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. "We gon' have a baby," she told him one night, her voice trembling with emotion. Josiah's face lit up like sunrise, and he pulled her close, laughing and crying at the same time. A baby, our baby, Harriet. Proof that love can survive even in hell. But they both knew the danger. A child born into slavery was another soul in bondage, another piece of property for Master Blackwell to own. Still, they couldn't help but hope. Maybe their child would be the one to see freedom. Maybe their love would be strong enough to protect this new life. As Harriet's belly began to swell, Nettie wept with both joy and sorrow. Big Samuel looked at his daughter with eyes full of pride and pain. Bessie and the other women in the quarters rallied around her, offering advice and support, sharing what little they had to prepare for the coming child. But in the shadows, Taggart watched, and in the big house, Master Blackwell made calculations, seeing not a new life but a future investment, another body to work his fields or sell for profit. Harriet worked through her pregnancy, her body growing heavier as the months passed. She felt the child move inside her, tiny kicks and flutters that filled her with wonder. Josiah would place his hand on her belly and talk to their unborn baby, telling it stories about freedom, about the ancestors, about the strength it would need to survive. "You gon' be strong like your mama," he'd whisper. "You gon' be a fighter." As Harriet's time drew near, a shadow fell across the plantation. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something terrible was coming. The old folks muttered about bad omens, owls hooting at noon, dogs howling at nothing, a stillness that felt like the world holding its breath. And then, on a night when the moon was just a sliver in the sky, Harriet's labor began. The pain came in waves, crashing over her like the ocean her ancestors had crossed. Nettie and Bessie and old Aunt Zara gathered round, praying and cooking herbs, doing everything they knew to ease her suffering. But something was wrong. Harriet could feel it in her bones, see it in the worried glances the women exchanged. The labor went on for days, days of screaming and praying, days of blood and sweat and fear. Josiah paced outside the cabin like a caged animal, forbidden from entering, forced to listen to the woman he loved suffering beyond his reach. And when finally the child came, a boy, perfect and still, the quarters went silent. The baby never drew breath, never cried, never opened his eyes to see the world that awaited him. He was born already gone, escaped into death before life could chain him. Harriet's scream when they told her shattered the night. It was a sound of pure anguish, a mother's grief pouring out in waves that made even the hardest hearts weep. She held her dead child against her chest, raining tears on his tiny face, refusing to let go even as the women gently tried to take him. "My baby," she sobbed. "My sweet baby boy. He never even got to live, never got to see the sun." Outside the cabin, a shadow moved. Taggart had heard the commotion, and in the morning, he reported to Master Blackwell that Harriet had failed in her duty to produce a healthy slave. The master's response was cold and calculating. "Weak stock," he muttered. "But that fistula she's got now, that's a medical curiosity. I heard tell of a doctor up from the north looking for subjects to study. Might be some profit in her yet." And that's when Harriet's real nightmare began. That's when a man named Dr. Elias Thorne entered her life, carrying a black bag full of knives and ambition, seeing in her broken body not a grieving mother but an opportunity for fame. As Harriet lay in that cabin, her body torn from the failed birth, her heart shattered from loss, she didn't know that her suffering had only just begun. She didn't know about the 550 surgeries that awaited her, the years of torture disguised as medicine, the pain so deep it would forge her into something new, something dangerous, But in that moment, as she held her dead child and felt the blood soaking through the sheets beneath her, Harriet made a promise to the ancestors, to the spirits in the crossroads, to every soul that had suffered under the yoke of bondage. One day, she swore in the silence of her heart, "One day they gon' pay, every last one of them. I swear it on my baby's grave." The shadow of the overseer fell across the cabin door, blocking out what little light remained. And Harriet looked up, her eyes no longer filled with tears but with something far more dangerous. A cold, burning rage that would smolder for years before finally igniting into flame. The days after losing her baby passed like a fever dream, heavy and slow and suffocating. Harriet lay in that cabin, her body torn and bleeding, while outside the world kept spinning like nothing had happened at all. The women tended to her best they could, Nettie pressing cool cloths to her burning forehead, Bessie cooking broths from roots and herbs, Aunt Zara muttering prayers in that old tongue and burning sweetgrass to keep the haints away. But there was a wound inside Harriet that no poultice could heal, a grief so deep it felt like drowning in dark water with no surface in sight. Josiah came every evening, sitting by her side in the dim light, holding her hand like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to this earth. His eyes were red from crying, his powerful shoulders bent under the weight of loss. They buried their son in the slave cemetery at the edge of the plantation, a tiny grave marked only by a wooden cross that Josiah carved with shaken hands. No minister came to speak words over him. No bells rang for his passing. He was just another black child who never got the chance to live, his brief existence noted only in the hearts of those who mourned him. "We gon' name him Samuel," Harriet whispered one night, her voice rough as gravel. "After my daddy, so he won't be forgotten." Josiah nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Samuel, our boy Samuel, may he rest with the ancestors, far from this cursed place." But grief was a luxury the enslaved couldn't afford for long. Within a week, Taggart was banging on the cabin door, shouting for Harriet to get herself back to work. "Master don't pay for lazy niggers laying around," he hollered, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "You got 2 more days, then I expect to see you in them fields or feel my whip across your back." Nettie tried to protest, explaining that her daughter was still bleeding, still too weak to stand. But Taggart just laughed that cruel laugh and walked away. The message was clear. Black pain didn't matter. Black grief was invisible. The only thing that mattered was the cotton, the tobacco, the endless cycle of labor that fed the master's wealth. When Harriet finally dragged herself from that cabin and back into the fields, something in her had changed. The other slaves saw it in her eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before, a coldness that made even Taggart think twice before getting too close. She moved through the tobacco rows like a ghost, her hands working mechanically while her mind drifted somewhere far away. But the grief didn't break her. No, it did something worse. It forged her, tempering her like iron in fire, turning her into something sharp and dangerous. The physical pain was constant. The birthing had torn something inside her, left her with a fistula that leaked and burned and made every step agony. She walked with a slight limp now, one hand pressed to her belly when she thought no one was looking, biting her lip to keep from crying out. But she refused to show weakness in front of the overseers. She'd learned early that weakness was blood in the water, and sharks always circled. Bessie stayed close to her in the fields, a strong-willed woman in her 30s who'd survived things that would have broken lesser souls. She had scars on her back from whippings, a brand mark on her shoulder from a previous master, and empty spaces in her smile where teeth had been knocked out. But she had a spirit that wouldn't quit, and she took Harriet under her wing like a sister. "I know that look in your eye," Bessie said one day as they worked side by side, their hands moving through the tobacco leaves. "That looked like you ready to burn the whole world down. I had it too after they sold my children away. 3 babies gone in one day. But listen here, child, you gotta be smart about your rage. You let it consume you, they win. You use it, channel it, wait for the right moment. That's when you strike." Harriet absorbed every word, storing it away like treasure. She watched how Bessie moved through the plantation, how she could smile and bow her head to the white folks while secretly sabotaging their work, slowing the pace just enough to hurt productivity, breaking tools in ways that looked accidental, spreading whispers that kept the spirit of resistance alive in the quarters. The nights were when Harriet felt most alive. After the sun went down and the overseers retired to their cabins, the slave quarters transformed into something else, a place where humanity refused to die. Folks would gather in the shadows, singing spirituals that carried double meanings, passing news from other plantations, sharing stories of successful escapes and failed rebellions. The old ones like Uncle Josiah, not her Josiah, but the ancient root doctor, would tell tales of conjure and hoodoo, of the power that lived in crossroads and graveyards, of ancestors who walked among them still. Harriet soaked it all in like parched earth drinking rain. She learned which herbs could heal and which could harm, which roots could protect and which could curse. She learned the songs that weren't really songs but maps. Follow the drinking gourd pointing the way north by the Big Dipper. Wade in the water, warning of dogs on the trail. Knowledge became her weapon, sharpening in secret while she played the role of obedient slave during daylight hours. Her Josiah remained her anchor through it all. Despite the grief that bound them, their love grew deeper, more desperate. They met in stolen moments. Behind the smokehouse at dusk, in the tobacco barn during rain, by the creek when the moon was dark. He'd hold her gently, mindful of her pain, and they'd whisper dreams that felt impossible but necessary for survival. "One day, Harriet," he'd promise, his voice thick with longing, "one day we gon' run, north to freedom, where our children can be born free." But the mention of children always brought tears to Harriet's eyes. The fistula made every day a misery, and she feared she'd never carry another child. That little Samuel would be her only baby, born dead into a world that didn't want him anyway. The physical pain was a constant reminder of what she'd lost, what had been stolen from her by a system that saw black women as breeding stock and nothing more. Months passed in this strange limbo. Harriet worked the fields by day, her body screaming in protest with every movement. She learned to hide the pain behind a mask of stoic endurance, refusing to give Taggart or Master Blackwell the satisfaction of seeing her suffer. At night, she'd collapse in the cabin, and Nettie would tend to her wounds with poultices and prayers, tears streaming down her mama's weathered face. "My baby girl," Nettie would whisper. "My strong baby girl. The ancestors watching over you. They got plans, even if we can't see 'em yet." Big Samuel grew quieter as the months wore on, his shoulders bending under invisible weight. He'd look at his daughter with eyes full of helpless rage, a father unable to protect his child from the horrors of their world. The light that had once shone in him was dimming, snuffed out slowly by years of brutality and powerlessness. Then came the day that changed everything. Harriet was working in the far field, bent over the tobacco plants with Bessie beside her, when she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see Master Blackwell riding toward them with a stranger, a thin white man in a dark suit, carrying a black leather bag that gleamed in the sunlight like something ominous. "That there's Dr. Thorne," Bessie whispered, her voice tight with fear. "I heard tell he's been experimenting on slave women, cutting them open to see how we made inside. Lord have mercy, Harriet. Don't let him see you hurtin'." But it was too late. Taggart had already told the master about Harriet's condition, about the fistula that made her limp and cry out when she thought no one was listening. And Master Blackwell, always calculating, always seeking profit even in suffering, had seen an opportunity. Dr. Elias Thorne dismounted his horse with the careful movements of a man unused to physical labor. He had cold eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, a thin mouth that rarely smiled, and hands that looked almost delicate. Surgeon's hands, precise and deadly. He walked through the field like he owned not just the land, but the bodies that worked it, studying the slaves with the detached interest of a man examining livestock. When his gaze fell on Harriet, she felt something cold crawl down her spine. This was danger in a different form. Not the crude violence of overseers and whips, but something more insidious, wrapped in the language of science and progress. "That one," Thorne said, pointing at Harriet with one long finger. I've been told she has a vesicovaginal fistula from a difficult birth. Perfect subject for my research. Harriet's blood ran cold. She'd heard whispers of what doctors did to slave women, cutting them open without mercy, experimenting on their bodies like they were animals, all in the name of advancing medical knowledge. And the worst part? They did it without anesthesia, claiming black folks didn't feel pain the same way white folks did. That suffering built character in the inferior races. Now, Dr. Thorne, Master Blackwell said with false generosity, you understand this is valuable property. I expect compensation if your procedures reduce her ability to work. Of course, Thorne replied smoothly. But think of the prestige, Blackwell. If I can perfect this surgery, your name will be associated with a medical breakthrough. And the girl, well, I'll cure her affliction. She should be grateful. Grateful. The word tasted like poison on Harriet's tongue. She was expected to be grateful for the knife, grateful for the torture, grateful for men deciding what to do with her body without ever asking her permission. Taggart grabbed her by the arm, his grip brutal. Come on, girl, doctor wants to examine you. No, Harriet said, the words spilling out before she could stop it. No, I ain't going. The slap came fast, Taggart's hand connecting with her face hard enough to split her lip. You don't got a choice, nigger. Now move. Bessie reached out as if to help, but Harriet shook her head slightly. There was no point in both of them getting punished. She let Taggart drag her toward a shed at the edge of the fields, a small building she'd never paid much attention to before, but which now loomed like the entrance to hell itself. Inside, the shed had been converted into a makeshift surgery. There was a wooden table in the center, straps hanging from its sides, and shelves lined with instruments that gleamed wickedly in the dim light. Scalpels and forceps and tools whose purposes Harriet couldn't even guess. The air smelled of blood and fear and something chemical that burned her nose. Strip her and get her on the table, Thorne ordered, already rolling up his sleeves. Please, Harriet begged, all pride abandoned in the face of terror. Please don't do this, I ain't done nothing wrong. But her pleas fell on ears that heard black voices as nothing more than animal sounds. Taggart and another overseer, a vicious man named Pike, ripped the clothes from her body, their rough hands showing no mercy for her modesty or her humanity. They threw her onto that wooden table like she was a sack of grain, and when she tried to fight, tried to kick and scratch and claw her way to freedom, they beat her until resistance seemed more costly than submission. The leather straps bit into her wrists and ankles, pulling tight until she couldn't move nothing but her head. She was splayed out like something crucified, naked and vulnerable, while Dr. Thorne circled the table with those cold, clinical eyes, examining her body like she was a specimen in a jar. Fascinating, he murmured, producing a notebook from his bag and scratching notes with a pencil. The damage is extensive. Multiple tears, significant scarring. This will require innovative surgical techniques. Will you use chloroform, doctor? Master Blackwell asked from where he stood near the door, a safe distance from the blood that was surely coming. Thorne looked up, almost surprised by the question. For a Negro, certainly not. The literature is quite clear that the African race has a higher pain tolerance and less refined nervous system than whites. Besides, I need her conscious to gauge her responses. Pain is an important diagnostic tool. Lies, all lies, but lies that white folks told themselves to justify the unjustifiable. Harriet knew the truth. They denied enslaved folks anesthesia not because black people felt less pain, but because black pain didn't matter. Because watching a black woman scream didn't disturb their consciences the way watching a white woman suffer would. No, Harriet whispered, tears streaming down her temples into her hair. Please, God, no, somebody help me. Josiah, Mama. But her screams couldn't reach beyond these walls. The shed was deliberately placed far from the quarters, far from where anyone who loved her might hear and try to intervene. She was alone with these men and their knives, alone with her terror and her pain. Thorne selected his first instrument, a scalpel that caught the light like a sliver of ice. Now then, let's begin. This may cause some discomfort. Discomfort. That word would haunt Harriet for years to come. Such a gentle word for the agony that followed. When the blade bit into her flesh, when it cut through tissue that was still tender from childbirth, still torn and inflamed, the pain was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. It was fire and lightning and drowning all at once, a suffering so complete it seemed to erase everything else in the world. She screamed. Lord, how she screamed, a sound so primal and raw it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat, from her very soul. She screamed until her voice cracked and broke, until there was nothing left but hoarse gasps and animal whimpers. The straps cut into her wrists as she thrashed, blood slickened the leather as she fought against bonds that wouldn't give. Hold still, Thorne snapped, annoyed like she was being deliberately difficult. Pike, restrain her head, I can't work with all this movement. Rough hands clamped around her skull, forcing her to stare at the ceiling while the doctor cut and probed and stitched. She could feel everything, the scalpel sliding through her flesh, the forceps pulling tissue apart, the needle piercing in and out as he sewed her wounds with all the care of a tailor mending a torn shirt. Minutes stretched into hours, hours into an eternity of suffering. Harriet's mind tried to escape, tried to flee to somewhere safe, but there was nowhere to go. The pain anchored her to her body, to this moment, to this table. She bit through her lip until blood filled her mouth. She prayed to God, to Jesus, to the ancestors, to anyone who might be listening, but no deliverance came. The only sounds were her screams, Thorne's clinical observations, and the wet sounds of surgery. Remarkable resilience, Thorne commented, pausing to wipe blood from his instruments. Most subjects lose consciousness by now. This one's constitution is quite robust. Subject, not woman, not person, subject. When it was finally over, when Thorne had satisfied his curiosity and done whatever experimental procedures he'd planned, they unstrapped her and let her fall to the floor like garbage. Harriet lay in a pool of her own blood, her body convulsing with shock and pain, unable to even crawl toward the door. Clean this up, Thorne instructed Taggart, already packing his instruments away, and have her back here in 3 days. The sutures will need examination, and I want to attempt another approach to the fistula repair. This first surgery was merely exploratory. Another approach. The words filtered through Harriet's haze of agony. He meant to do this again, and again, as many times as it took to perfect his technique, using her body as his practice ground. She gonna be able to work? Master Blackwell asked, his only concern. In a few days, certainly. The surgery wasn't that extensive, merely some internal repairs and tissue exploration. She's strong enough. They left her there on that blood-soaked floor while they discussed her future, like she wasn't even present. Finally, Taggart threw a dirty blanket over her naked, trembling body and dragged her out of the shed, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt as he hauled her back toward the quarters. Bessie and Nettie found her dumped outside their cabin like trash. Their cries of horror brought others running. Big Samuel, Josiah, Aunt Zara, half the quarters pouring out to see what had happened. When they saw Harriet, barely conscious and soaked in blood, covered in cuts and bruises, the grief and rage that rose up was like a physical force. "What they done to you, baby?" Nettie sobbed, gathering her daughter into her arms. "Oh Lord, what they done?" But Harriet couldn't answer. She could only lay there shaken, her eyes staring at nothing, her mind shattered by what she'd endured. Josiah knelt beside her, tears streaming down his face, his powerful hands hovering over her like he wanted to help but didn't know how without causing more pain. "I'ma kill him," Josiah whispered, his voice trembling with murderous intent. "I'ma kill that doctor and the master and every last one of them white devils." "No," Big Samuel said, grabbing his arm. "That's what they want. An excuse to hang you, to make an example. We gotta be smart, son. We gotta survive." But survival seemed like too much to ask as they carried Harriet into the cabin and laid her on her pallet. Aunt Zara came with her herbs and poultices, muttering prayers and burning sage, trying to heal wounds that went deeper than flesh. The old conjure woman's hands trembled as she worked, tears rolling down her ancient face. "This evil," she whispered, "this evil beyond evil. The ancestors weeping tonight. The spirits cry out for justice. Through the night, Harriet drifted in and out of consciousness, her body burning with fever and infection. She dreamed of the middle passage, of chains and dark water, of screams that echoed across centuries. She dreamed of her baby Samuel, his tiny, perfect face, and wondered if death might not be a mercy compared to what awaited her. But when dawn came and she opened her eyes to see Josiah sitting beside her, holding her hand like a lifeline, something hard crystallized in her chest. Not acceptance, not submission, but a cold, calculating rage that would smolder for years before finally blazing into terrible flame. 3 days later, just as Thorne had promised, Taggart came for her again. And despite her screams, despite Josiah's pleas and Nettie's tears, they dragged her back to that shed for the second surgery. And then the third, and the fourth, and on, week after week, month after month, year after terrible year. The first surgery had been exploratory, Thorne said, but there would be 549 more before he was done with her. 549 more knives, 549 more screams, 549 more times Harriet would lie on that table and beg for mercy that never came. But with each cut, with each violation, with each moment of unspeakable agony, Harriet was being transformed. The girl who'd once dreamed of freedom and love and a better life was dying. And in her place, something else was being born. Something forged in pain and rage and the unbreakable will to survive. Something dangerous, something that would one day make them all pay. The memory of that first surgery never left Harriet's mind, never stopped playing over and over like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. But what came after? The knowledge that it wouldn't be the last, that she was trapped in an endless cycle of torture disguised as medicine. That was its own special kind of hell. Each time Taggart came for her, Harriet's body would start shaking uncontrollably, her mind screaming in protest, even as she forced herself to walk toward that cursed shed on legs that felt like water. The second surgery came 3 days after the first, just as Dr. Thorne had promised. By then, Harriet's wounds had barely begun to heal, the stitches pulling tight and painful with every movement. She'd spent those 3 days in the cabin, unable to work, drifting in and out of fever dreams while Aunt Zara applied poultices and whispered prayers in that old African tongue. But Master Blackwell wouldn't let her rest longer. 6 slaves meant lost profits, and he'd already made clear that Harriet's value now lay not in field work, but as Dr. Thorne's experimental subject. "Consider it an honor," Thorne had told her during that second surgery, his voice calm and clinical as the scalpel bit into her flesh once more. "You're contributing to the advancement of medical science. Future generations will benefit from what I learned from your body." But there was no honor in screaming until her throat bled, no advancement in suffering that served only white ambition. The second surgery lasted longer than the first. Thorne was attempting a different technique for repairing the fistula, one he'd read about in a medical journal from Europe. He worked methodically, taking notes between each incision, describing his observations aloud like he was lecturing to invisible students. "The tissue here is particularly resilient," he commented, pulling at something inside her that made Harriet shriek in agony. "Note the scarring pattern from the previous procedure. I'll need to excise this section entirely before attempting the new suture pattern." Master Blackwell had stopped attending the surgeries after the first one. Even his stomach couldn't handle watching what his hired doctor did to human flesh. But other white men came, drawn by morbid curiosity or genuine medical interest. They'd stand along the walls of the shed, arms crossed, watching Harriet's torture like it was theater, like her screams were entertainment. Some took notes, others just stared with eyes that held no compassion, only cold fascination. "Does she always scream this much?" one asked, his voice tinged with annoyance rather than concern. "The Negro is quite vocal," Thorne replied dismissively, "but I assure you their nervous systems are less refined than ours. What appears to be extreme distress is simply a more primitive response to stimulation. More lies to justify the unjustifiable." But Harriet heard every word, stored every insult, every casual cruelty, in the growing catalog of grievances she kept in her heart. She memorized their faces, not just Thorne and Blackwell and Taggart, but all of them. Every white man who'd stood in that shed and watched her suffer without lifting a finger to stop it. One day, she promised herself through the haze of pain, one day they'd answer for this. The third surgery came a week later, then the fourth, then more and more, the weeks blurring together into an endless cycle of cutting and stitching and screaming. Thorne was obsessed, determined to perfect his technique, convinced that Harriet's body held the key to some medical breakthrough that would make his name famous in surgical circles. He tried different approaches, different tools, different angles of incision. When one method failed, he'd simply try another, never considering that maybe the problem wasn't his technique, but the fundamental horror of what he was doing. Between surgeries, Harriet was sent back to the fields to work. Her body barely healed before it was put under strain again. The other slaves watched her with a mixture of pity and terror. Pity for what she endured, terror that they might be next. Thorne had already started eyeing other women, particularly those who'd suffered difficult births or had other medical conditions he wanted to study. Bessie, who'd been like a sister to Harriet, now walked with constant vigilance, always keeping away from the white men's notice. "You gotta eat, child," Nettie would plead, trying to force broth past Harriet's lips when she lay in the cabin after each surgery. "You gotta keep your strength up." But food tasted like ash in Harriet's mouth. Her body was wasting away, becoming nothing but skin stretched over bones, a canvas of scars and sutures. The fistula remained unhealed despite all of Thorne's cutting. If anything, it was worse now, the repeated surgeries causing more damage than they repaired. But Thorne wouldn't admit defeat. Each failure only made him more determined to try again. Josiah stayed by her side through it all, his love unwavering even as Harriet felt herself becoming something less than human, more like a broken thing held together by rage and spite. He'd hold her when the nightmares came, when she'd wake up screaming, convinced she was still strapped to that table with the knife cutting into her. He'd whisper promises of escape, of freedom, of a future where they'd be safe from white men and their cruelties. "We gon' run," he'd say, his voice fierce with determination. "Soon as you can travel, soon as we get a chance, we taking off for the North Star. I don't care if they hang me for trying. I ain't letting them kill you slow like this." But Harriet knew running was a dream more distant than the moon. She could barely walk without pain shooting through her body, could barely work a full day without collapsing. How could she run? How could she survive the long journey north, dodging paddy rollers and slave catchers, hiding in swamps and forests? She was trapped, and she knew it. The surgeries continued. By the 20th, Harriet had stopped counting. By the 30th, she'd stopped screaming. Not because the pain was any less, but because her voice was permanently damaged from all the screaming she'd already done. Now she could only make hoarse animal sounds, gasps and whimpers that seemed to satisfy Thorne's need for vocal confirmation of his work. Aunt Zara came to her one night after a particularly brutal surgery, the old conjure woman's eyes gleaming with something between grief and rage. She knelt beside Harriet's pallet and took her scarred hands in her own ancient ones. "Listen to me, child," Aunt Zara whispered, her voice urgent and low. "The ancestors been speaking to me. They say your suffering ain't without purpose. They say you being forged like iron and fire, that you gon' be the weapon that strikes back. But you gotta survive. You gotta hold on." "I can't," Harriet whispered, her voice broken. "I can't do this no more, Auntie. I wanna die. Please, just let me die. Just..." "No," Aunt Zara said fiercely, squeezing her hands. "You don't get to die, not yet. First you gon' learn. You gon' watch that doctor, watch how he mixes his potions, watch which herbs he uses. You gon' memorize every poison, every cure, every secret he thinks you too ignorant to understand. And when the time come, when the ancestors give the sign, you gon' use that knowledge. You gon' make them pay for every cut, every scream, every drop of blood they took from you." The words penetrated the fog of Harriet's pain, planting a seed in soil that had seemed too barren to grow anything. Revenge. Not just escape, but vengeance. The thought was intoxicating, dangerous, necessary. She began to pay attention during the surgeries, forcing her mind to stay sharp even as her body screamed. She watched Thorne mix his cleaning solutions, noted which bottles he pulled from his bag, listened when he explained his techniques to the observing doctors. She learned that he used chloroform on white patients but never on black ones. She learned that he kept laudanum in a blue bottle and carbolic acid in a brown one. She learned which instruments caused the most damage, which sutures held best, which incisions were most likely to cause infection. She became a student of her own torture, absorbing knowledge that she'd one day turn into a weapon. The surgeries mounted, 40, 50, 60. Harriet's body became a roadmap of Thorne's ambitions, every scar a testament to his failure and her endurance. But something else was growing alongside the scars, a cold, patient rage that would wait years if necessary before striking. She stopped begging for mercy, stopped crying out to God. The only thing she whispered now, under her breath in the moments between consciousness and oblivion, was a promise. One day I'ma poison every last one of you. One day this farm gon' burn. And in the shadows of the shed, unseen by the white men with their knives and their notebooks, the ancestors listened and approved. By the time Harriet had endured 70 surgeries, Dr. Thorne's ambitions had expanded beyond just one subject. Word of his pioneering work had spread through medical circles in the South, and other plantation owners began offering up their enslaved women for his experiments. Soon, Harriet wasn't alone in that shed of horrors. Other sisters in bondage joined her in suffering, their screams mingling with hers to create a chorus of agony that the white men called the advancement of science. The first to come was a woman named Lula, brought from a plantation 20 miles away. She was younger than Harriet, maybe 16 or 17, with eyes that still held a flicker of hope, a hope that would be extinguished quickly in Thorne's hands. Lula had suffered a fistula too, hers from a birth that had lasted 3 days and left her baby dead and her body torn beyond simple healing. When they strapped her to the table for the first time and she realized no anesthesia was coming, her screams pierced the air like knives. Harriet watched from the corner where they'd chained her. Thorne had taken to keeping her in the shed between her own surgeries, claiming he needed to monitor her recovery, but really just wanting a convenient subject always on hand. She watched Lula's initiation into hell and saw her own past reflected in those wide, terrified eyes. When it was over and they left Lula crumpled on the floor, Harriet crawled over to her despite the chains cutting into her ankles. "Sister," Harriet whispered, her ruined voice barely audible. I know what you feeling, but you gotta survive this. We all gotta survive." Lula looked at her through tears and blood, and in that moment a bond was forged. Not through joy or love, but through shared trauma. Through the knowledge that they were both trapped in a nightmare with no visible end. They held each other on that filthy floor. 2 black women whose bodies had been turned into battlegrounds, and found strength in simple human connection. More women came. Bessie, who Harriet had thought safe from Thorne's notice, was dragged in after she developed a tumor in her belly, something Thorne wanted to study and ultimately remove, without any regard for whether she survived the procedure. When Bessie saw Harriet chained in the corner, her face crumpled. "Oh, child," Bessie sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I should have done something to stop this." "Ain't nothing you could have done," Harriet replied, her voice steady despite the fresh wound still bleeding on her body. "Ain't nothing nobody can do. All we can do is endure." There was Rosa, an older woman who'd been a midwife on her plantation until she developed complications from delivering her own stillborn child. There was Judith, barely 14, whose master had raped her repeatedly until her internal organs were damaged beyond natural repair. There was Mary and Grace and Sarah, women whose names Harriet would never forget, whose screams would echo in her dreams forever. They became a sisterhood of suffering, bound together not by choice but by circumstance. When one was on the table, the others would watch and bear witness, refusing to let their sisters suffer alone and forgotten. They'd hold hands through the chains, whisper prayers in African tongues their grandmamas had taught them, sing spirituals so soft the white men couldn't hear, but loud enough to comfort the one under the knife. "Swing low, sweet chariot," they'd murmur, the melody barely a breath, "coming for to carry me home." Between surgeries, when Thorne wasn't in the shed and only an overseer stood guard, the women would talk. They'd share stories of their lives before the table. Memories of children lost and loves destroyed. Dreams of freedom that seemed more impossible with each passing day. Harriet, who'd been there longest, became their quiet leader. Not through any claim to authority, but simply because she'd survived what they were all enduring. "How many times?" Lula asked one night, her voice small in the darkness. "How many times he cut you?" "Lost count after 100, Harriet lied, not wanting to terrify the younger woman with the true number. "But I'm still here, still breathing, still fighting." "Fighting how?" Bessie asked, her strong-willed nature still intact despite her own torture. "What fighting can we do when we chained up like animals?" Harriet's eyes gleamed in the dim light filtering through the shed's cracks. "We learn. We watch. We remember. Every bottle he opens, every tool he uses, every weakness he shows. We store it all away, and one day, we use it." The women understood. Revenge was the only future they could imagine, the only hope worth clinging to. So they watched Thorne with the careful attention of prey studying a predator, noting his habits and patterns. They saw that he always arrived at noon, that he kept his instruments in a specific order, that he mixed his cleaning solutions fresh each day from bottles he stored on a high shelf. They saw that he was arrogant, convinced of his own superiority, never imagining that the black women he tortured were capable of sophisticated thought or planning. Rosa, the former midwife, had knowledge of herbs and roots from her years of delivering babies. She'd whisper to Harriet about plants that grew in the woods, nightshade and hemlock, foxglove and deadly mushrooms. "The masters think we ignorant," Rosa said, her voice bitter. "But we the ones who know what grows in the earth, what heals and what kills. Our mamas taught us, and their mamas before them." Judith, despite her youth and the horror she'd endured, had a sharp memory. She could recall every detail of the bottles on Thorne's shelf, could describe exactly which ones held what substances. "The brown bottle," she'd say, closing her eyes to picture it. "That's carbolic acid. Burn your skin right off if you touch it straight. And the clear one with the red label. That's something he uses to preserve specimens in. Poison if you drink it." They were building an arsenal of knowledge, piece by piece, surgery by surgery. Every woman contributed what she knew, what she'd seen, what she remembered from before the chains. Harriet absorbed it all, her mind sharp despite her body's deterioration, organizing the information like a general planning a campaign. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. They needed opportunity, and opportunity was scarce when you were chained in a shed and guarded day and night. The overseers rotated, sometimes Taggart, sometimes Pike, sometimes a young man named Daniels who seemed uncomfortable with the screams, but not uncomfortable enough to object. They were armed with whips and guns, and the women were weak from blood loss and starvation. Still, they began to test small rebellions. Rosa would pretend to faint during her surgery, forcing Thorne to pause and revive her, stealing precious moments of delay. Bessie would thrash so violently on the table that it took 3 men to hold her down, tiring them out and frustrating Thorne. Harriet, when her turn came, would fix Thorne with a stare so cold and full of hate that even he sometimes faltered, uncomfortable under the weight of her gaze. "She looks at me like she's cursing me," Thorne complained to Blackwell one day, not knowing that Harriet could hear every word. "Like she's some kind of witch." "She's just a slave," Blackwell replied dismissively. "Ignore her." But Harriet was cursing him, had been cursing all of them every night with words Aunt Zara had taught her, drawing symbols on the floor with her own blood, praying to the ancestors for justice and vengeance. Whether the curses worked or not didn't matter. The act itself gave her power, reminded her that she was more than just a body on a table, more than just a subject for white men's experiments. One night, when the guard had fallen asleep and the women were alone in the darkness, they formed a circle as best they could with their chains. Harriet led them in a ritual half-remembered from Aunt Zara's teachings, mixing African spirituality with Christianity with root work into something uniquely their own. "We call on the ancestors," Harriet whispered, her voice ragged but fierce. We call on all the ones who came before, who suffered and died in these chains. We ask for strength to endure. We ask for wisdom to know when to strike. We ask for justice, not in the next life, but in this one. Amen, the women murmured. Amen and ash. They made a pact that night, sealed in blood and pain and shared suffering. If one of them found opportunity for revenge, she'd take it, knowing the others would support her even if it meant their own deaths. They'd rather die fighting than continue living as victims. They'd rather burn together than suffer alone. The surgeries continued, but now they continued with purpose. Every cut Thorne made was one step closer to his own doom. Every scream the women released carried a promise of retribution. They were no longer just victims. They were witnesses, collectors of evidence, judges waiting to pass sentence. And when the time came, when the moment finally arrived for justice to be served, they'd be ready. The pact the women made in darkness was tested sooner than any of them expected. Word came down from the big house that Master Blackwell was in financial trouble. Cotton prices had dropped, tobacco crops had failed, and he needed quick money. That meant only one thing for the enslaved folks on the plantation. Auction day was coming, and families would be torn apart like paper in the wind. Harriet heard the news from Taggart himself, who took pleasure in delivering it while she was chained in the shed between surgeries. "Master's selling off some of you niggers," he said with that cruel smile of his. "Your brother's already been sold to a plantation in Georgia. Chain gang work, brutal stuff. Probably won't last a year." The words hit Harriet like a physical blow. Her brother Thomas, just 16 years old, sold away to a life of breaking rocks and dragging iron in the Georgia heat. She'd barely seen him in recent months, her own torture keeping her isolated in the shed. But he'd been out there somewhere on the plantation, alive and whole. Now he was gone, disappeared into the vast machinery of slavery that ground up black bodies and spit out profit for white men. "And your sister," Taggart continued, watching her face for reaction like a cat playing with a mouse. "Pretty little thing. She's been sold to a house in New Orleans. You know what kind of house takes young colored girls in New Orleans, don't you?" Harriet's vision went red. Her sister Celia, sweet Celia, who'd just turned 15, sold to a brothel where white men would use her body until it was used up and thrown away. The rage that rose in Harriet was volcanic, but she forced herself to stay still, to not give Taggart the satisfaction of seeing her break. She'd learned that lesson well. Never show weakness to predators. But inside, something fundamental was shifting. The rage she'd been nursing, the cold calculation she'd been developing was turning into something hotter, more immediate. Her family was being destroyed piece by piece, and she was powerless to stop it, chained up like an animal while Dr. Thorne used her body for his experiments, and Master Blackwell sold her kin for gambling debts. When Bessie was brought into the shed after her own surgery that evening, Harriet told her the news. Bessie's face crumpled. She'd lost her own 3 children to auction years ago, knew the particular hell of having family ripped away. "I'm so sorry, sister," Bessie whispered, reaching through her chains to hold Harriet's hand. "Lord knows I'm sorry. But this what they do. This what they always done. They break us by taking what we love. Then we break them back," Harriet said, her voice cold as winter steel. "We make them pay for every child, every mama, every soul they sold away. We burn this whole rotten system to the ground." The other women murmured agreement, their faces hard in the dim light. They'd all lost people to the auction block. Children, parents, lovers, friends. The collective grief and rage in that shed was enough to power a revolution, if only they could find a way to channel it. Days later, more news came. Josiah, her Josiah, the man she loved, the blacksmith who'd promised to run north with her, had been caught plotting escape. Someone had overheard him talking to other slaves about the Underground Railroad, about routes north and safe houses. The punishment for such conspiracy was death, and Master Blackwell wasted no time in making an example. They hanged Josiah from the old oak tree at the edge of the plantation, the same tree where they'd hanged countless others before him. All the slaves were forced to watch, gathering in a silent crowd while Josiah stood on a wagon with a noose around his neck, his hands bound behind his back. Harriet wasn't there. Chained in the shed, she could only hear the commotion, could only imagine the horror of what was happening. But Bessie was there, forced to witness, and she told Harriet every terrible detail later that night. "He was brave," Bessie said, tears streaming down her face. "Even with that rope around his neck, even knowing he was about to die, he stood tall. And before they kicked that wagon out from under him, he looked right at the big house and said, 'One day every slave gonna be free. One day all y'all gonna answer for what you done.' Then they dropped him, and he—" Bessie couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. Harriet understood. The man she loved was dead, hanged like an animal for daring to dream of freedom. The father of her dead child, the partner who'd held her through countless nights of pain, was gone. And she hadn't even been allowed to say goodbye, hadn't been allowed to see his face one last time. The grief was overwhelming, crashing over her in waves that threatened to drown her. But beneath the grief was rage. Rage so pure and hot it felt like it could melt iron. They'd taken everything from her, her baby, her body, her family, her love. What more could they take? What more was there to lose? That night, chained in the shed with her sisters in suffering, Harriet made a decision. She wouldn't wait anymore for the perfect opportunity. She wouldn't spend years collecting knowledge and planning revenge. No, she'd act soon, and she'd act decisively. She'd use everything she'd learned about Thorne's poisons and medicines, everything Rosa had taught her about deadly plants, everything the ancestors had whispered in her fevered dreams. She'd poison them all. Master Blackwell, Dr. Thorne, Taggart, every white person on this plantation who'd participated in her torture or turned a blind eye to her suffering. She'd taint their food, their water, their very air if she could, and she'd watch them die slowly, painfully, knowing exactly what was happening to them but unable to stop it. "I need your help," Harriet told the other women, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "I need Rosa to tell me exactly which plants to use and where to find them. I need Judith to help me remember which bottles in Thorne's collection hold what. I need all of you to be ready to act when the moment comes. Can you do that?" The women looked at each other in the darkness, their faces grave. They knew what Harriet was proposing meant certain death if they were caught. Death by torture, probably, made into examples to terrify the other slaves into submission. But they also knew they were dying anyway. Slowly, surgery by surgery, cut by cut. At least this way they'd die fighting. At least this way they'd take their oppressors with them. "We with you," Lula said, her young voice fierce. "Whatever you need, sister, we with you till the end." "Till the end," the others echoed. "Till the bitter end." Harriet nodded, feeling the weight of their trust settle on her shoulders. She thought of Josiah swinging from that oak tree, thought of her brother Thomas breaking rocks in Georgia, thought of sweet Celia in some New Orleans brothel. She thought of baby Samuel, who never got to draw breath. She thought of the 150 surgeries she'd endured so far, with hundreds more promised. And she began to plan their retribution in earnest. Time became meaningless in the shed of horrors. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Harriet stopped marking the passage of seasons, stopped counting birthdays or holidays. Her only calendar was the rhythm of surgeries, the endless cycle of cutting and stitching that Dr. Thorne performed with the dedication of a man obsessed. 200 surgeries, 300, 400, each one a fresh violation, each one a new lesson in endurance. Harriet's body became a patchwork of scars, her flesh so marked by Thorne's knife that there was barely any unmarred skin left. She looked like something pieced together from scraps, a monster made by white ambition and black suffering. "Subject exhibits remarkable resilience," Thorne would write in his notebooks, his handwriting neat and precise. "After 347 procedures, tissue regeneration continues, though scarring is extensive. The fistula remains unrepaired, but the experimental value of continued attempts cannot be overstated." The fistula, the very condition he'd promised to cure, had never healed. If anything, Thorne's repeated surgeries had made it worse, turning a simple tear into a complex maze of damaged tissue and failed repairs. But he wouldn't admit defeat. wouldn't acknowledge that his methods were torture disguised as medicine. Each failure only drove him to try again, convinced that the next surgery would be the breakthrough he sought. Harriet counted every single one in her mind, even when she told the others she'd lost track. Surgery 423. He tried a new suture pattern learned from a colleague in Charleston. Surgery 424. He attempted to graft tissue from her thigh. Surgery 425. He used silver wire instead of catgut. Each number was branded in her memory, each procedure a mark in the ledger of debts that would one day be paid. Between surgeries, when Thorne allowed her brief periods of recovery, Harriet worked in the fields when her body permitted. She moved like a ghost among the tobacco plants, her scarred hands still able to work even when the rest of her screamed in protest. The other field hands gave her a wide berth, uncomfortable with the visible evidence of her suffering, but also respectful of her endurance. She'd become a legend in the quarters, the woman who couldn't be broken, who survived what should have killed her 100 times over. But survival came at a cost. Harriet could feel parts of herself dying, not her body, which stubbornly refused to give up despite Thorne's best efforts to destroy it, but something deeper. The girl who'd once dreamed of love and freedom and a better future was long gone, replaced by something harder, colder, more dangerous. She was becoming a weapon forged in pain and tempered in rage. Rosa, the former midwife, taught her everything she knew about plants and poisons during the brief moments when the guards weren't paying close attention. "Nightshade grows in the woods near the creek," Rosa would whisper, her voice barely audible. "Small purple flowers, black berries. 5 berries can make a man sick, 10 can kill him. But you gotta crush them first. Mix them with something to hide the taste." Harriet memorized it all. She learned about hemlock and foxglove, about mushrooms that looked harmless but brought agonizing death. She learned which roots could induce vomiting and which could stop a heart. She learned that the white snake root that grew in the shaded areas could poison milk, killing anyone who drank it. Every piece of knowledge was a tool, every lesson a step closer to justice. Judith, with her sharp memory, helped Harriet catalog Thorne's medical supplies. "The blue bottle on the second shelf, that's laudanum," Judith would recite like a prayer. "Enough of it and a man sleeps forever. The brown bottle next to it, carbolic acid. Burns from the inside out if you swallow it. And that clear liquid in the glass jar, that's chloroform. Same stuff he won't use on us but saves for white patients." The irony wasn't lost on Harriet. The very substances that could have eased their pain would become instruments of revenge. Thorne had taught them what could kill just as surely as Rosa had, though he'd never intended such lessons. His arrogance made him careless, never imagining that the black women he tortured were capable of turning his own knowledge against him. As the surgeries mounted past 500, Harriet began to notice changes in Thorne himself. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be. His eyes looked tired and bloodshot. His temper grew shorter. The burden of his obsession was weighing on him, though he'd never admit it. He'd sacrificed his reputation in respectable medical circles for this work. Colleagues whispered that his methods were barbaric, that he'd gone too far even for the standards of the time. But he couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, driven by the need to justify all the suffering he'd caused by achieving some breakthrough. "Why won't you heal?" he'd mutter during Surgery 512, his frustration evident. "Why does the tissue keep rejecting the sutures? What am I missing?" What he was missing was humanity. What he was missing was the understanding that you can't heal what you keep cutting, can't repair what you continuously destroy. But Harriet didn't tell him that. She just lay on the table, silent now. She'd long since stopped screaming, her voice reduced to hoarse whispers, and watched him with eyes that held nothing but cold calculation. The other women cycled through their own nightmares. Bessie's tumor was removed in Surgery 89 for her, but it grew back. And Thorne removed it again in Surgery 134, then again in Surgery 203. Lula endured her 100th surgery and emerged changed, the hope in her eyes finally extinguished, replaced by the same hard rage that burned in Harriet. Rosa, Judith, Mary, Grace, Sarah, all of them marked by Thorne's knife, all of them counting their own surgeries, all of them waiting for the day of reckoning. They were no longer women in any way the white folks would recognize. They were evidence, living testimony to the horrors of slavery, to the evil that men could do when they saw other humans as property. Their bodies told stories that would make angels weep, and their eyes held knowledge that would terrify their tormentors if they ever truly looked. But the white men never looked, not really. They saw subjects and specimens, property and investments. They never saw the intelligence gathering in the shed, the conspiracy forming in whispered conversations, the revolution brewing in hearts that refused to break. Surgery 550 approached like a dark milestone. Harriet knew, had been told by Thorne himself in one of his more talkative moments, that this would be the last one. He'd finally admitted defeat, though he framed it as reaching the limits of current surgical knowledge, rather than acknowledging his failure. After Surgery 550, he'd declare her a successful case study despite the fistula remaining unhealed, write his papers, and move on to other experiments on other black bodies. The night before Surgery 550, Harriet lay in the shed with her sisters and made her final plans. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "After the surgery, when Thorne is packing up his instruments, I'ma take what we need from his bag. Rosa, you ready to guide me to where the nightshade grows?" "I'm ready," Rosa confirmed. "Been ready for years." "And the rest of you," Harriet continued, looking at each woman in turn. "When the time comes, when the whites start falling sick, you gotta be ready to run. This gon' bring hell down on all of us, but at least we'll die free of their knives." The women nodded, their faces grave but determined. They'd made their peace with death long ago. Now they were just negotiating the terms of their departure, making sure they took their tormentors with them when they went. As dawn broke on the day of Surgery 550, Harriet felt almost calm. This was the beginning of the end, the first step toward the retribution she'd been planning for years. Thorne's knife had made her into something new, something dangerous. Now she'd show him exactly what he'd created. Surgery 550 began like all the others, with the leather straps biting into Harriet's wrists and ankles, with the cold metal of the table pressing against her scarred back, with Dr. Thorne's clinical voice describing his intended procedure to an audience of watching white men. But something was different this time. As the first cut pierced her flesh, as the familiar lightning bolt of agony shot through her body, Harriet felt her mind begin to drift in a way it never had before. She was leaving her body, floating up and away from the table where that broken, scarred thing lay screaming silently. She rose through the roof of the shed, through the trees, through the very clouds themselves, rising into darkness that somehow felt like home. And in that darkness she wasn't alone. They came to her like smoke and memory. The ancestors, the ones who'd crossed the Middle Passage in chains, the ones who died in the hulls of slave ships with salt water in their lungs and freedom songs on their lips. They surrounded her, these spirits of the dead, their faces both strange and familiar, their voices speaking in tongues she'd never learned but somehow understood. "Daughter of sorrow," they whispered, their voices mingling like wind through leaves. "Daughter of iron and fire, we have watched you suffer. We have counted every cut, every tear, every drop of blood spilled on unholy ground." Harriet tried to speak, but in this place beyond pain, she had no voice. She could only listen as the ancestors spoke truths she'd always known but never put into words. "You think you alone?" an old woman said, her face weathered like ancient wood. "You think you the only one they broke on the altar of their greed? Child, we are millions. Millions who died screaming. Millions who suffered in silence, millions who never got the chance to strike back. But you still breathing. You still got fire in your belly. You are weapon now." A man stepped forward, his back covered in scars like Harriet's own. "They tried to make you nothing," he said, his voice deep as thunder. "Tried to reduce you to flesh and function. Tried to erase your humanity. But every time that knife cut you, you remembered. Every time they strapped you down, you learned. Every time they hurt you, you got stronger. That's the secret they don't know. Pain can forge as well as break." More voices joined the chorus, each one telling their own story of suffering and resistance. There was a woman who'd thrown herself overboard during the Middle Passage rather than live in chains. There was a man who'd led a rebellion and been burned alive for it. There was a mother who'd poisoned her own children to spare them from slavery. Each spirit carried wounds, carried grief, but also carried knowledge. "We gon' teach you now," the old woman said, reaching out to touch Harriet's forehead with fingers that felt like cool water. "We gon' show you what your grandmamas knew, what the root doctors and conjure women carried across the ocean in their memories. This knowledge is your birthright, passed down through blood and bone." Visions flooded Harriet's mind. Images of plants and roots, of rituals and prayers, of the old ways practiced in secret under the cover of darkness. She saw women gathering herbs by moonlight, mixing potions in clay pots, whispering incantations in languages the slave masters couldn't understand. She saw the power that lived in the natural world, in the crossroads and the graveyards, in the liminal spaces where the veil between worlds grew thin. "Nightshade," the ancestors chanted, showing her the plant in perfect detail. 5 berries to sicken, 10 to kill. Crush them fresh, mix with honey to hide the bitter taste. Add it to wine or water, to bread or stew. The poison works slow, gives you time to escape before they know what hit them. They showed her hemlock growing by the creek, its white flowers innocent-looking but deadly. They showed her foxglove with its purple blooms that could stop a heart. They showed her the mushrooms that grew in the shadowed places, how to tell the deadly ones from the safe. They showed her how to make gopher dust, grave dirt mixed with sulfur and salt, and where to sprinkle it to bring sickness and confusion. But more than recipes, they gave her permission. Permission to be angry, permission to seek revenge, permission to use every tool at her disposal to strike back at her oppressors. The Christian God that Master Blackwell preached about on Sundays might demand forgiveness, but the ancestors understood justice in a more primal form. They understood that sometimes the only response to evil was equal and opposite force. "Don't you feel guilty?" a young woman's spirit said, her voice fierce. "Don't you hesitate. They built their wealth on our bones, their comfort on our suffering. Every white person on that plantation who turned a blind eye to your torture, who profited from your pain, they all guilty. And guilty men deserve punishment." "But what about the innocent?" Harriet asked, finding her voice at last. "The children, Ain't no innocent white folks on a slave plantation," the old woman interrupted sharply. "Every one of them benefits from this system. Every one of them sleeps in comfort while you bleed. Even the ones who claim they against slavery. They still own you, still profit from your labor. They all complicit." The truth of it settled into Harriet's bones like lead weight. There was no moral high ground to claim here, no way to be righteous in a system built on total evil. The only choice was between continued victimhood or active resistance, between dying slow under the knife or taking her tormentors with her. "We with you," the ancestors promised, their voices rising in a chorus that sounded like spirituals and war cries combined. "When you walk in those woods to gather your poison, we'll guide your steps. When you slip your hand into Thorn's bag to steal what you need, we'll blind the eyes of the watchful. When you add death to the master's cup, we'll steady your hand. You ain't alone in this. You never been alone." Harriet felt their strength pouring into her, felt centuries of resistance and rebellion flowing through her veins like blood. She was part of something larger than herself, part of an unbroken chain of people who refused to accept their bondage quietly. Every ancestor who'd resisted, who'd fought back, who'd chosen death over submission. They were all standing with her now. "When you done," the old woman said, her ancient eyes holding infinite wisdom and infinite sorrow, "when you burn that plantation to the ground and watch your oppressors die, you remember us. You remember that every scream, every flame, every drop of poison is for all of us. For the millions who couldn't fight back, for the ones still in chains, for the generations yet unborn who deserve better than this." "I remember," Harriet promised, her voice strong. "I remember, and I will make them pay." The vision was fading now, the ancestors pulling back into darkness, but their presence remained, a warmth in her chest, a certainty in her mind. She was falling back into her body, back into the pain of Surgery 550, but she fell different than she'd risen. She fell empowered, armed with knowledge and blessed by the dead. When she opened her eyes on that table, when she felt Thorne's knife still cutting into her flesh, Harriet didn't scream. Instead, she smiled. A cold, terrible smile that made even Thorne pause in his work, uncomfortable without knowing why. The ancestors had spoken, the path was clear, and Harriet of the Surgeries was ready to become something new. Harriet the Avenger, Harriet the Poisoner, Harriet who would burn the whole Virginia plantation and everyone on it. Surgery 550 ended with Dr. Thorne finally declaring victory despite his obvious failure. "The subject has been successfully treated," he announced to his audience of physicians, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a man who'd learned to lie to himself. While complete resolution of the fistula remains elusive, the experimental data gathered over these procedures represents a significant contribution to medical science. They unstrapped Harriet from the table and left her on the floor like always, but this time she didn't just lie there bleeding and broken. This time, as Thorne packed his instruments with his back turned, as the other doctors filed out discussing their observations, Harriet's hand moved with purpose. She'd been watching Thorne's routine for years, knew exactly where he kept each bottle, each vial, each tool. Her fingers closed around a small glass container of laudanum, enough to make a man sleep forever, and she slipped it into the folds of the dirty blanket they'd thrown over her. The guard, a young overseer named Daniels who was squeamish about the surgeries, didn't notice. He was too busy averting his eyes from her nakedness, too uncomfortable with the blood pooled beneath her. He dragged her back to the shed's corner where the women were chained and left quickly, eager to escape the smell of suffering. "You got it," Bessie whispered once they were alone. Harriet nodded, pulling the bottle from the blanket and showing it to her sisters. In the dim light, the liquid inside gleamed like liquid amber, beautiful and deadly. "First piece of the puzzle," she said, her voice hoarse but triumphant. "Now we need the plants Rosa told us about." The planning began in earnest. They had to be careful, had to move in small increments that wouldn't draw suspicion. The white folks saw enslaved people as simple-minded, incapable of complex thought or long-term planning, and the women used that prejudice against them. They played their roles perfectly, obedient slaves who'd been broken by torture, no longer capable of resistance. But beneath the surface, rebellion was brewing. Rosa was the first to act. She'd been assigned to work in the plantation's vegetable garden. Thorne wanted her to have light duty after her latest surgery, and she used the opportunity to gather what they needed. Nightshade grew wild at the garden's edge where it met the woods. She picked the berries carefully, hiding them in the pocket of her apron, her movements casual like she was just pulling weeds. "Got them," she whispered that night, showing the others her prize. Small blackberries, innocent looking but filled with death. "Need to dry these and crush them fine. Mix with something sweet to hide the taste." Judith, who worked in the big house now, Mistress Blackwell, had taken a liking to her quiet demeanor. Never suspecting the rage that burned beneath, began sabotaging in small ways. She'd add too much salt to the food, making it barely edible. She'd accidentally break dishes, slowing down meal service. She'd leave windows open so flies got in, spreading disease and discomfort. Nothing big enough to get her punished, but enough to create chaos and distraction. Lula, still working the fields, began teaching the other slaves how to work slow without getting caught. "Move like you tired," she'd say. "Drop tools like you clumsy. Pick the cotton but leave the best bowls on the plant. Little things add up. Makes the master lose money, makes him desperate." And it worked. Master Blackwell's profits were dropping, his temper rising. He couldn't figure out why his plantation was becoming less productive, why his slaves seemed more incompetent than usual. He blamed it on laziness, on the inferiority of the Negro race, never realizing that his own cruelty had created an organized resistance movement right under his nose. Harriet, still recovering from Surgery 550, watched it all from the shed and coordinated the efforts. She'd become the general of a silent army, directing operations through whispered conversations and coded messages passed between the women. Every small act of sabotage was a victory, every moment of chaos a step closer to the final reckoning. But they needed to test their poison first, needed to make sure it worked before using it on the white folks. The opportunity came when one of the plantation's hunting dogs, a vicious beast named Brutus that the overseers used to track runaways, was tied up near the shed. The dog had terrorized enslaved folks for years, had torn into the flesh of countless people trying to escape. "That dog deserve what's coming," Bessie said, her voice hard. "How many of our people he caught? How many he ripped apart?" Harriet nodded. She'd mixed the nightshade berries with a piece of salted pork, crushing the berries fine and working them into the meat. In the dead of night when the guards were sleeping, she tossed the poisoned meat to Brutus. The dog gobbled it down, tail wagging, thinking he'd gotten a treat. The women watched and waited. Within an hour, Brutus started showing signs of distress. Excessive drooling, staggering, whimpering. By dawn, the dog was dead, foam around its mouth, body convulsing in its final moments. "It works," Rosa confirmed, examining the corpse through the shed's cracks. "Nightshade done what it's supposed to do. Mix it right and a man go down just as hard as that dog." The overseers blamed the dog's death on bad meat or disease, never suspecting poison. Why would they? Slaves didn't have the intelligence or opportunity for such things, or so they believed. Their arrogance was their weakness, and the women exploited it ruthlessly. Emboldened by success, the sabotage escalated. Tools mysteriously broke in the fields. Horses went lame from nails strategically placed in their stalls. Food spoiled faster than it should, plagued by contamination that looked natural. The big house's well water developed a strange taste. Not poison yet, just herbs that made folks queasy, a warning shot across the bow. Master Blackwell raged and threatened, had overseers whip random slaves to restore order, but the rebellion continued. It was everywhere and nowhere, impossible to pin down because it looked like accidents and natural misfortune rather than organized resistance. And through it all, Harriet gathered her arsenal. More laudanum stolen from Thorne's bag. Hemlock collected from the creek. Foxglove from the shadowed woods. Mushrooms dried and ground into powder. Each poison was tested on vermin or small animals. Each one proved effective. She stored them carefully in small bottles and cloth pouches, hiding them in places the white folks would never think to look. The ancestors whispered encouragement in her dreams, showed her visions of the plantation burning, of white folks gasping their last breaths while black folks walked free. The spirits guided her hands as she mixed her poisons, blessed her work with their ancient power. "Soon," Harriet told her sisters one night, her eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Soon we strike for real. Soon they gon' know what it means to suffer." The women smiled, terrible, vengeful smiles that would have terrified anyone who saw them. They were ready. They'd been ready for years. Now it was just a matter of choosing the perfect moment to unleash hell. The turning point came on a Sunday morning when the white folks were all dressed in their finest, heading to church to praise a God who apparently approved of their slaveholding ways. Harriet watched from the shed's small window as Master Blackwell and his family climbed into their carriage, as Dr. Thorne mounted his horse, as the overseers put on clean shirts and pretended to be civilized men instead of the beasts they truly were. "Hypocrites," Bessie muttered, watching alongside her. "Gon' sing hymns and pray while we rot in chains. Gon' ask Jesus for blessings they don't deserve." But Harriet wasn't focused on their hypocrisy. She was focused on opportunity. With the white folks gone for hours, with only a skeleton crew of overseers left behind to watch the plantation, she had the perfect window to act. The time for small sabotage was over. The time for real vengeance had arrived. "Today," she said, turning to face her sisters, "we start today. Rosa, Judith, you know what to do?" The women nodded, their faces grim with determination. They'd rehearsed this plan 100 times in whispered conversations, had mapped out every detail, every contingency. Rosa would go to the well that served the big house and add a carefully measured dose of hemlock to the water. Not enough to kill immediately, but enough to make folks sick, to weaken them for what was coming next. Judith, who had access to the big house kitchen, would add crushed nightshade berries to the bread dough that was rising for tomorrow's meals. "What about Taggart?" Lula asked, her young face hard with hatred for the overseer who'd brutalized them all. "Him I'm handling personal," Harriet replied, pulling out the bottle of laudanum she'd stolen from Thorne. "He got a taste for whiskey, drinks every night in his cabin. Tonight his bottle gon' have something extra in it." The guard posted outside the shed that morning was Daniels, the squeamish one. Harriet called out to him, her voice weak and pitiful. "Please, sir, I need to use the privy. I'm sick something terrible from yesterday's surgery." Daniels hesitated. He wasn't supposed to let them out unsupervised, but the thought of Harriet soiling herself in the shed was too much for his delicate sensibilities. "Make it quick," he said, unlocking her chains. "And don't try nothing foolish." Harriet limped toward the outdoor privy, moving slow like her body was barely functional. But once she was out of Daniels's direct line of sight, she veered toward the well instead. Her heart pounded as she pulled the small vial of hemlock from where she'd hidden it in her dress. The liquid inside was clear as water, deadly as sin. She looked around. No one watching. Everyone distracted by Sunday routines. With hands that had endured 50 surgeries but still worked with precision, she poured the hemlock into the well bucket, watched it dissolve into the water that would be drawn up for cooking and drinking in the big house. Not enough to kill outright. That would raise immediate suspicion. Just enough to sicken, to confuse, to make the whites vulnerable. "For Samuel," she whispered, thinking of her dead baby. "For Josiah. For Thomas and Celia. For every soul they destroyed." She made it back to the privy and then to the shed before Daniels got suspicious. He locked her chains again, never knowing that death had just been introduced to the plantation's water supply. That afternoon, while the white folks were still at church, Judith slipped into the big house kitchen. The cook, an old slave woman named Martha who'd served the Blackwells for 40 years, was napping in the corner, exhausted from preparing the Sunday meal. Judith moved silently to where the bread dough sat rising, pulled out her small pouch of crushed nightshade berries, and kneaded them into the dough with practiced hands. The berries disappeared into the bread, invisible, undetectable. Tomorrow morning, when the Blackwell family sat down to breakfast, they'd eat poison disguised as hospitality. They'd butter their bread and praise the cook's skill, never knowing that each bite brought them closer to agony. As evening fell and the white folks returned from church, the women in the shed waited with bated breath. Had the hemlock been discovered? Had Judith been caught? But the plantation continued its normal rhythms. Overseers changing shifts, slaves serving dinner in the big house, the sounds of white laughter drifting through the warm Virginia air. Harriet's moment came after dark. She'd convinced Daniels earlier that she needed special medicine for her wounds, had played up her pain, until he'd reluctantly agreed to let her go to Taggart's cabin to request it. "Just be quick," Daniels had said, uncomfortable as always with her suffering. Taggart's cabin was set apart from the others, a small structure where he lived alone with his whiskey and his cruelty. Harriet knocked on the door, her body bent and broken-looking, the perfect picture of a defeated slave. "What you want?" Taggart growled, opening the door with a bottle already in his hand. His eyes were bloodshot, his breath reeking of alcohol. "Please, sir," Harriet said, her voice meek. "I'm hurtin' terrible from the surgery. Dr. Thorne said you might have some medicine to help me sleep." Taggart sneered. "Thorne said that, did he? Well, I ain't got nothing for you, girl. Now get back to the shed before I give you something else to hurt about." But as he turned away, Harriet saw her opportunity. His whiskey bottle sat on the table, half empty, cap off. In the split second while his back was turned, she pulled out the laudanum and poured it into his bottle. The entire contents, enough to kill a horse. The liquid mixed with the whiskey seamlessly, undetectable. "Thank you anyway, sir," Harriet said, already backing away. "I'll just suffer through it." Taggart waved her off dismissively and returned to his bottle. Harriet walked back to the shed with her heart racing, knowing that before this night was over, the overseer who'd brutalized her for years would be dead. The women waited in tense silence. An hour passed, then 2. Then they heard it. A crash from Taggart's cabin, the sound of a body hitting the floor. They strained to hear more, but there was only silence after that. Heavy, final silence. "Is he?" Lula whispered. "Dead or dying," Harriet replied, her voice steady. "The laudanum works fast in high doses. He'll just look like he drank himself to death. Ain't nobody gonna question that." The next morning confirmed it. One of the field hands found Taggart's body slumped over his table, the whiskey bottle knocked over, his face blue and lifeless. The other overseers shook their heads, muttered about how the man couldn't hold his liquor, and moved on with their day. No investigation, no suspicion. Just another white man dead from his own vices. But in the big house, something else was happening. The Blackwell family was sitting down to breakfast, spreading butter on fresh-baked bread, pouring water from the well to wash it down. Within hours, they'd start feeling sick. Stomach cramps, nausea, confusion. The poison was in their systems now, spreading through their blood, breaking down their bodies from the inside out. The plague had begun. In the shed, Harriet and her sisters held hands and prayed, not to the white man's God, but to the ancestors, to the spirits of resistance, to the old powers that had sustained their people through centuries of bondage. They prayed for strength to finish what they'd started, for courage to see it through to the bitter end. "No turning back now," Bessie said, her voice filled with grim satisfaction. "We done crossed the line. Now we see it through till the plantation burns." "Till it burns," the women echoed. "Till every last one of them pays for what they done." And Harriet, scarred and broken but undefeated, smiled in the darkness. By the third day after the poisoning began, the Blackwell plantation was descending into chaos. Master Blackwell himself was the first to show serious symptoms. Violent stomach cramps that doubled him over, vomiting that wouldn't stop, a fever that made him delirious and raving. Mistress Blackwell followed soon after, her delicate constitution crumbling under the assault of hemlock and nightshade working together in her system. "It's the plague," she screamed from her sickbed, her face pale and sweating. "God is punishing us. We're all going to die." The overseers, who'd been drinking from the same well and eating from the same kitchen, started dropping like flies. Pike, the vicious one who'd held Harriet down during countless surgeries, developed seizures that made his body convulse and foam pour from his mouth. Another overseer named Jenkins went blind, his eyes clouding over as the poison attacked his nervous system. They called for doctors from Richmond, but the doctors who came were baffled. This didn't look like any disease they'd encountered before. "Could be cholera," one physician suggested, examining Master Blackwell's symptoms. "Or perhaps typhoid. The well water should be tested." But testing the water wouldn't help. Harriet had been careful to add only enough poison to sicken, not enough to be easily detected. And besides, she wasn't done yet. Every night, under cover of darkness, she or one of her sisters would slip more poison into the water supply, into the food stores, into the wine cellar where Master Blackwell kept his finest bottles. Dr. Thorne, who'd been staying in the big house while conducting his experiments, fell ill on the 4th day. Sweet Jesus, the irony of it. The man who'd caused Harriet so much pain was now experiencing agony of his own. He lay in bed clutching his stomach, his precise surgeon's hands shaken uncontrollably, his clinical mind unable to diagnose his own condition. "It makes no sense," he muttered through chattering teeth. "The symptoms don't align with any known pathology. Unless..." But he never finished that thought. The poison was working on him differently than the others, the nightshade affecting his heart, making it beat irregular and weak. Within days, his skin took on a grayish pallor, his breathing became labored, and he couldn't stand without collapsing. The enslaved folks watched it all with carefully neutral faces, expressing appropriate concern when the white folks were looking, but smiling cold smiles when they were alone. The plague spreading through the big house was justice manifest, divine retribution for years of cruelty. And the best part? Nobody suspected them. "How could niggers do this?" one overseer said, too sick to even raise his whip. "They ain't got the intelligence for poison. This is God's work or devil's work, but not slave work." Their prejudice was their blindness, and the women exploited it ruthlessly. Judith continued her work in the kitchen, adding crushed foxglove to the soup that was supposed to help the sick recover. Rosa tended the gardens and, accidentally, let deadly mushrooms mix with the edible ones. Lula worked in the stables and made sure the horses' water troughs were contaminated, causing the animals to sicken and die, cutting off the plantation's means of transportation. The death toll mounted. First it was Taggart, found dead drunk or so they thought. Then it was Pike, who died screaming in his bed, clawing at invisible demons. Then Jenkins, who stumbled blind into the well and drowned. Master Blackwell's oldest son, a young man who'd taken pleasure in watching the surgeries, developed bloody flux and wasted away to nothing in less than a week. The plantation's crops began to fail too, not from poison, but from neglect. With the overseers sick or dead, with Master Blackwell too ill to give orders, the enslaved folks simply stopped working as hard. Fields went untended, tobacco rotted on the stalk, cotton bolls opened and fell to the ground unpicked. The whole enterprise that had been built on stolen labor was crumbling without the whip to drive it forward. Mistress Blackwell, in her delirium, started raving about curses and haints. "I see them," she shrieked, pointing at shadows. "The dead slaves, they're coming for us. They're in the walls, in the water, in the very air we breathe." She wasn't entirely wrong. The spirits of all those who'd suffered and died on this plantation were indeed gathering, drawn by the scent of justice being served. Harriet could feel them at night, could sense their presence in the shed where she and her sisters waited and watched. The ancestors were pleased with the work being done. By the second week, panic had fully set in. The remaining healthy overseers wanted to abandon the plantation entirely, convinced that some terrible disease was sweeping through and would kill them all. But Master Blackwell, even from his sickbed, refused to leave. "This is my land," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "Built by my father, my grandfather. I won't be driven off by some plague. We'll weather this storm, you'll see." But there was no weather in this storm. Harriet had made sure of that. She'd poisoned not just the people, but the very foundation of the plantation. The wells, the food stores, the wine cellar, even the communion wine in the plantation chapel. Death was everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily life, impossible to escape. Dr. Thorne, in a moment of terrible clarity before the poison finally claimed him, figured it out. He was lying in bed, barely able to move, when his eyes fell on his medical bag across the room. He noticed that his bottles had been disturbed, that the laudanum was missing, that other substances seemed lighter than they should be. "Poison," he whispered, the word coming out like a death rattle. "We've been poisoned. The slaves. Somehow they..." But he died before he could share his revelation, his heart finally given out under the strain of the nightshade. His last thought was of Harriet, of the black woman he'd cut into 550 times, and he wondered, with the last spark of consciousness he possessed, if she'd somehow orchestrated this, if the subject had become the experimenter, turning his own knowledge against him. He died not knowing the truth, but suspecting it, and that suspicion followed him into whatever hell awaited men like him. In the slave quarters, though, folks were whispering about miracles. "Ain't none of us sick," they marveled, gathering in secret meetings. "This plague, whatever it is, it only touching the white folks. It's like God finally heard our prayers." "Ain't God," old Aunt Zara said, her ancient eyes gleaming with knowledge. "It's justice. It's the ancestors working through certain hands to bring down the wicked. Don't question it. Just be ready to run when the time comes." Because the women in the shed had made plans for that too. Once the plantation was thoroughly devastated, once the white power structure had collapsed completely, they'd make their escape north. They'd follow the drinking gourd to freedom, leaving behind nothing but ashes and bodies. The plantation that had once been a symbol of white wealth and black suffering was becoming a tomb, and Harriet, from her chains in the shed, watched it all with satisfaction cold as winter frost. She counted each death like she'd counted her surgeries, a ledger of justice being balanced, one soul at a time. "How many left?" Bessie asked one night, as they listened to sounds of mourning coming from the big house. "Not enough," Harriet replied, her voice hard. Not nearly enough, not till every last one of them is in the ground. The plantation was dying, but it wasn't dead yet. And dying things, especially when they white and powerful, get desperate and vicious. Master Blackwell, even from his sickbed with poison eating through his guts, wasn't so far gone that he couldn't smell conspiracy in the air. The fact that not a single enslaved person had fallen ill while every white person on the plantation was suffering, that couldn't be coincidence, not even in his fevered mind. "Bring me the slaves," he croaked to the one remaining healthy overseer, a young man named Crawford who'd just arrived from another plantation the week before and hadn't drunk from the poisoned well yet. "Question them. Use whatever means necessary. Someone knows what's happening here." Crawford was cruel in the way young men are cruel when given power, eager to prove himself, quick with the whip, hungry for violence. He started with the field hands, dragging them one by one to the whipping post and demanding answers they didn't have. The screams echoed across the plantation as flesh split under leather, but nobody talked because most folks truly didn't know. Harriet and her sisters had kept their conspiracy tight, shared only among the women in the shed. But one person knew more than she should have. Old Martha, the cook who'd served the Blackwell family for 40 years, had seen Judith kneading something into the bread dough that Sunday morning. At the time, she'd thought nothing of it. Her eyes were weak, her mind focused on her nap. But as the plague spread and folks started dying, memory returned with terrible clarity. Crawford came for Martha on the third day of questioning, found her in the kitchen trembling and terrified. "You know something, old woman?" he said. Not a question, but a statement. "I can see it in your eyes. Talk now, or I'll make you wish you had." Martha held out for an hour under Crawford's questioning. She'd lived her whole life in bondage, had endured more suffering than most could imagine. But she was old now, her body fragile, her spirit worn down by decades of servitude. When Crawford threatened to sell her grandbabies away, to separate them forever, something broke inside her. "It was Judith," she sobbed, the words spilling out like poison themselves. "I saw her put something in the bread, dark powder, crushed fine. And I heard the women in the shed talking at night, heard them whispering about poison and revenge. But I swear I didn't know for certain, I swear I—" Crawford didn't wait to hear more. He rounded up his men, a militia of poor whites from neighboring farms who'd been called in to help contain the plague, and marched straight to the shed where the women were kept. They burst through the door with rifles and torches, their faces twisted with rage and fear. "You bitches!" Crawford screamed, striking Bessie across the face with the butt of his rifle. "You've been poisoning us. Where is it? Where's the poison?" The women stayed silent, their faces impassive even as blows rained down on them. They'd known this moment might come, had prepared themselves for it. Better to die under torture than confess and give their oppressors the satisfaction. But Crawford was thorough. He tore apart the shed, searching every corner, every crack, every hiding place. And he found them. The small bottles hidden in the rafters, the pouches of dried nightshade tucked into the walls, the vials of hemlock concealed under loose floorboards. Evidence of conspiracy, of murder, of slaves daring to strike back at their masters. "Hang them," Master Blackwell ordered from his sickbed when Crawford brought him the evidence. "Hang them all. Make it slow. Make it public. Make sure every nigger on this plantation sees what happens to those who forget their place." But Harriet wasn't ready to die yet. She'd accomplished what she set out to do. The plantation was devastated, the white power structure crumbling, justice served in blood and poison. Now it was time to finish the plan, to escape while chaos reigned. That night, while Crawford and his militia were celebrating their discovery with stolen wine from the master's cellar, wine that Harriet had personally poisoned weeks ago, she made her move. The chains that bound them in the shed were old, the locks rusted. Rosa, who'd learned lockpicking from a lover years ago, worked on them with a piece of wire she'd kept hidden. It took hours of patient effort, her fingers bleeding from the metal cutting into her skin. But finally the locks gave way with soft clicks. "We have to go now," Harriet whispered to her sisters, "before they come back, before they string us up as examples." "What about the others?" Lula asked, meaning the enslaved folks in the quarters. We just gon' leave them? We spread the word, Harriet said firmly. Tell them the North Star is waiting. Tell them to run while the whites are too sick and confused to chase. But we can't save everybody. Some will choose to stay, some will be too scared to run. We can only save ourselves. They moved through the plantation like shadows, silent as death itself. The big house was dark except for a few flickering candles, the groans of the dying audible even from outside. The quarters were quiet, folks sleeping fitfully or whispering about the day's events. Harriet stopped at her mama's cabin, found Nettie awake and waiting like she'd known this moment was coming. "Mama," Harriet whispered, kneeling beside her. "Come with us. We running north, following the drinking gourd to freedom." But Nettie shook her head, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I'm too old, baby, too tired. My running days are over. But you young enough, strong enough. You survived what should have killed you 100 times over. You meant for freedom, child. Go claim it." "I can't leave you," Harriet sobbed, the first tears she'd shed in years finally breaking free. "You can and you will," Nettie said firmly. "I'll be fine, and when I pass from this world, I'll pass knowing my daughter got free, knowing she struck back at the devils who tried to break her. That's enough for me. That's more than enough. Now go before they catch you." Harriet hugged her mama one last time, breathing in the scent of her, memorizing the feeling of those arms around her. Then she stood and walked away, each step breaking her heart but also freeing her soul. The women gathered at the edge of the woods, Harriet, Bessie, Rosa, Judith, Lula, and 3 others who joined them. Behind them, the Blackwell plantation burned. Not literally, not yet, but it was burning all the same, consuming itself from the inside out, a funeral pyre built from its own evil. As they disappeared into the darkness following the North Star toward freedom, they heard the baying of hounds in the distance. Crawford had discovered their escape and was organizing a chase. But the women had a head start, and they had something the slave catchers didn't: the blessing of the ancestors, the guidance of the spirits, and the unbreakable will of those who'd survived the unsurvivable. "Run!" Harriet commanded, her scarred body finding strength it shouldn't have. "Run and don't look back. Freedom's waiting on the other side of this night." And they ran. They'd been running for 3 hours through Virginia woods, thick with shadow and danger, when Harriet heard it. The unmistakable sound of dogs on their trail, the shouts of white men hungry for black blood. Crawford had recovered faster from the poisoned wine than she'd hoped, or maybe he hadn't drunk enough to be incapacitated. Either way, the chase was on, and the women were exhausted, their bodies weakened by years of torture and deprivation. "Split up," Bessie panted, her strong legs already giving out. "We split up. Some of us might make it." "No," Harriet said fiercely, grabbing Bessie's arm. "We stay together. We're stronger together. The ancestors didn't bring us this far to abandon each other now." They pushed deeper into the woods, following the creek like Rosa had taught them. Water would hide their scent from the dogs. The night was dark, only a sliver of moon providing light. But that darkness was their friend. They knew these woods better than the white men chasing them, had gathered herbs and roots here in secret, had learned every path and hollow. But the dogs were gaining, their baying getting louder, closer. And then Harriet saw it, the old tobacco drying shed, abandoned years ago when the Blackwell plantation had shifted to growing cotton. It stood in a clearing, its door hanging crooked on broken hinges, its walls weathered, but still standing. "In there," she commanded, and the women didn't question her. They piled into the shed, breathing hard, hearts pounding like drums. Harriet was the last to enter, and as she did, she saw torchlight flickering through the trees. Crawford and his men, maybe a dozen strong, armed with rifles and whips in righteous fury. And at the front of the group, barely able to stand but driven by vengeance, was Dr. Thorne himself. The poison should have killed him by now, but spite was keeping him alive, hatred giving him strength his body no longer possessed. "They went in that old shed," one of the militiamen shouted. "We got them cornered." The women huddled in the darkness of the shed, knowing this might be their end. But Harriet wasn't finished yet. She'd brought fire, flint and tinder stolen from the big house, and she had one more act of defiance left in her. "Listen to me," she whispered to her sisters. "If we gon' die tonight, we die on our terms. We burn this shed with us in it before we let them take us back alive. Agreed?" The women nodded, their faces solemn but resolved. They'd rather burn than return to bondage, rather die free than live enslaved. But then the shed door burst open, and Crawford stood there with a rifle pointed at Harriet's chest. "Out," he commanded. "All of you, out now. Master wants to see justice done proper, wants to watch you hang." Harriet stepped forward into the torchlight, her scarred body on full display, her eyes meeting Crawford's without fear. Behind him, Dr. Thorne leaned on a walking stick, his face gray as ash, death already claiming him though he refused to acknowledge it. "You," Thorne whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of recognition and horror. "You did this, my subject, my experiment, you've killed us all." "Not your subject," Harriet said, her voice ringing clear and strong despite years of screaming. "Not your experiment. I'm a woman, a human being, and everything you'd done to me, everything you took from me, I'm just returning the favor. You wanted to study pain? Well, now you experiencing it yourself. How does it feel, doctor? How does it feel to suffer without mercy?" Thorne's face contorted with rage and something else, maybe guilt, maybe recognition of his own monstrosity reflected back at him. "You're an animal," he spat, "a savage. I was trying to help you to advance medical science for the benefit of all mankind. You cut into me 550 times without giving me anything for the pain," Harriet said, stepping closer. "You strapped me to a table and experimented on my body like I was nothing but meat. You took notes while I screamed. And you call me the savage?" The truth of her words hung in the air like smoke. Even Crawford looked uncomfortable, and some of the militiamen shifted their feet, avoiding eye contact. They'd all known what was happening in that shed, had all turned blind eyes to it because black suffering didn't register as real suffering in their minds. "Enough talk," Crawford said, raising his rifle. "You're coming back to face justice. Master Blackwell wants—" "Master Blackwell is dying," Harriet interrupted. "Right now, as we speak, the poison is eating through his organs. By morning, he'll be dead. And you, Crawford, you drank that wine tonight, didn't you? You celebrated catching us with the Master's finest vintage?" Crawford's face went pale as understanding dawned. The wine. He'd drunk deeply, celebrating his victory. And if it was poisoned? "You lying," he said, but his voice wavered. "Am I?" Harriet smiled, a terrible smile that held no warmth. "Feel your stomach yet? That little twist of nausea? That's just the beginning. In a few hours, you'll be vomiting blood. In a day, you'll be begging for death. And there's nothing you can do to stop it." Crawford stumbled backward, his hand going to his belly. The other men murmured nervously, looking at each other with growing fear. Had they been poisoned too? Were they all doomed? "Shoot her!" Thorne shrieked, his voice cracking. "Shoot them all! They're witches, demons sent to destroy us." But in that moment of confusion, of fear taking root in the hearts of white men who'd never known what it meant to be powerless, Harriet acted. She pulled the flint from her dress and struck it against the tinder she'd prepared, creating a spark that caught on the dry wood of the shed. Fire bloomed to life, spreading faster than anyone could react. "Run!" she shouted to her sisters, and they burst from the shed in different directions, scattering into the night while the white men were distracted by the flames. Harriet ran straight at Thorne, her body colliding with his weakened frame and knocking him to the ground. They landed in the dirt, face to face, and for a moment time seemed to stop. She looked into the eyes of the man who'd tortured her, saw the fear there, the recognition that he was meeting his judgment. "This is for every cut," she whispered, "for every scream, for every moment of suffering you caused. May you burn in hell, doctor." Then she was up and running, leaving Thorne gasping in the dirt behind her. She heard rifles crack, felt bullets whistle past her head, but the darkness swallowed her. She ran through the woods with supernatural speed, her ruined body finding reserves of strength it shouldn't possess, the ancestors guiding her feet away from danger. Behind her, the tobacco shed burned like a beacon, and she heard men shouting in confusion and fear. The fire was spreading to the dry grass, catching on the trees, beginning to consume the woods themselves. Let it burn, Harriet thought. Let it all burn. Let Virginia itself burn for what it allowed to happen on its soil. She ran until her lungs were fire and her legs were water, until she couldn't hear pursuit anymore, until she collapsed beside a stream in the deep woods. She lay there gasping, bleeding from scratches and bullet grazes, but alive, impossibly, miraculously alive. And somewhere in the darkness, she heard her sisters calling to each other, regrouping, surviving. Not all of them. Some had fallen to bullets, some had been caught. But enough. Enough to carry the story forward, to testify to what had happened, to make sure the world knew what Harriet of the Surgeries had done. Freedom was still miles away, but it was waiting. And Harriet would reach it even if she had to crawl. Dawn broke over Virginia with smoke rising from the Blackwell plantation, like offerings to angry gods. The tobacco shed fire had spread through the night, consuming outbuildings and fields, licking at the edges of the big house itself. Harriet watched from a hilltop a mile away, hidden in the tall grass with Bessie, Rosa, and Lula, the only sisters who'd made it through the chaos of the previous night. Judith had been caught, her screams echoing through the woods until they'd suddenly stopped. The others had scattered in different directions, their fates unknown. "We can't stay here," Bessie said, though her eyes remained fixed on the burning plantation. "They'll be organizing search parties come full light. We gotta move north, follow the drinking gourd like we planned." But Harriet couldn't look away from the destruction she'd wrought. Somewhere in that burning hellscape, Master Blackwell was dying, if he wasn't dead already. Dr. Thorne, too, assuming the poison had finally claimed him. The plantation that had been built on stolen black labor, that had profited from black suffering for generations, was crumbling into ash and memory. "It's beautiful," Rosa whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Lord, forgive me, but it's the most beautiful thing I ever seen." They stayed only long enough to watch the big house catch fire, its white columns blackening in the flames, its windows shattering from the heat. Then they turned their backs on Virginia and headed north, following the North Star that had guided countless freedom seekers before them. The journey was brutal. They had no food, no water except what they could find in streams, no shoes that weren't already falling apart. Their bodies were broken from years of torture. Harriet's especially, scarred and damaged by 550 surgeries. Every step was agony, every breath a struggle. But they kept moving, driven by the knowledge that to stop was to die, or worse, to be captured and returned to bondage. They traveled by night, sleeping in hidden hollows during the day. Rosa knew which plants were safe to eat, which roots could sustain them when hunger threatened to break their resolve. They avoided roads and towns, moving through the wilderness like ghosts, leaving no trail for the slave catchers who surely hunted them. On the third night, they reached the James River. It was wide and dark, the current strong enough to drown the unwary. But water was the pathway to freedom. It hid their scent from the dogs, washed away their tracks, created barriers the pursuers couldn't easily cross. "Wade in the water," Harriet sang softly, the old spiritual taking on new meaning. "Wade in the water, children. God's gonna trouble the water." They waded in, gasping at the cold, struggling against the current. Bessie, the strongest swimmer among them, helped pull the others across. Halfway through, Lula started to go under, her young body too exhausted to fight anymore. Harriet grabbed her, refusing to let the river claim another victim, dragging her to the far shore through sheer force of will. They emerged on the northern bank like creatures being reborn, coughing up river water and trembling with cold and exhaustion. But they'd crossed a boundary, left Virginia behind. Each mile north was a mile closer to freedom. Each river crossed was another barrier between them and slavery. They found help along the way. The Underground Railroad was real, not just a story whispered in slave quarters. A Quaker family sheltered them in a barn outside Richmond, giving them bread and blankets and directions to the next safe house. A free black man in Maryland gave them shoes and warm clothes, asked no questions, simply helped and sent them on their way with prayers for safe passage. "Follow the moss," he told them. "It grows on the north side of trees. And watch for markers, quilts hanging certain ways, lanterns in windows. The railroad has signs if you know how to read them." They learned to read those signs, to navigate by stars and moss and the kindness of strangers who risked everything to help fugitives reach freedom. They crossed into Pennsylvania on a frozen December morning, their breath misting in the cold air, their hearts pounding with anticipation and fear. "Is this it?" Lula asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Are we free now?" "Not yet," Harriet said, though something in her chest was loosening, a weight she'd carried for so long beginning to lift. "Not till we're somewhere they can't drag us back. Not till we're truly safe." They pushed on to Philadelphia, arriving in the city on Christmas Eve. The streets were decorated with ribbons and lights, people moving with purpose and joy. And among them, Lord have mercy, among them were black folks walking free. Black men in fine coats, black women in beautiful dresses, black children playing without fear of being sold away. The sight brought all 4 women to tears. An abolitionist meeting house took them in, gave them warm beds and hot food and medical attention. A Quaker doctor examined Harriet's scars, his face grave as he counted the surgical marks on her body. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice gentle but horrified. "A man named Dr. Elias Thorne," Harriet replied. "But he's dead now. They're all dead now. The plantation burned and the poison I gave them finished what the fire didn't." The doctor didn't judge, didn't recoil. He simply nodded, understanding that justice sometimes came in forms that polite society couldn't acknowledge. "You're safe now," he said. "No one can take you back. You're free." Free. The word felt strange on Harriet's tongue, like a language she'd never learned to speak properly. She'd spent so long being property, being a subject for experimentation, being nothing but a body to be used and discarded. Who was she now, without the chains? Who was Harriet when she wasn't defined by suffering? That night, lying in a real bed with clean sheets, Harriet closed her eyes and spoke to the ancestors. She thanked them for their guidance, for giving her the strength to survive and the knowledge to strike back. She thanked them for leading her to freedom, for protecting her on the long journey north. And she made them a promise. She wouldn't forget. She wouldn't let the world forget what had happened on the Blackwell plantation, what had been done to her and her sisters in the name of medical science. She'd bear witness. She'd tell the story. And through the telling, she'd make sure that every surgery, every scream, every drop of blood spilled would be remembered and counted against those who'd caused such suffering. In the morning, she woke to snow falling outside the window, the first snow she'd seen as a free woman. Bessie was already awake, standing at the window with a smile on her face. "We made it," Bessie said simply. "Against all odds, we actually made it." "We made it," Harriet agreed, joining her at the window. "Now we figure out what free living looks like." Behind them, Rosa and Lula still slept, their faces peaceful for the first time in years. And outside, Philadelphia was waking up to another day in a world that was slowly, painfully, beginning to recognize that black folks were human beings deserving of freedom and dignity. The journey wasn't over. Freedom was a daily struggle, not a destination. But they'd won this battle, had survived what should have killed them, had struck back at their oppressors and lived to tell the tale. And that, Harriet thought as she watched snow cover the city in white, was victory enough. Years passed like water flowing north, carrying Harriet further and further from the Virginia plantation that had tried to break her. She settled in Philadelphia, working as a seamstress, her scarred hands that had once picked tobacco now creating beauty from cloth and thread. The physical wounds never fully healed. Her body remained a map of Dr. Thorne's cruelty, 550 surgeries etched into her flesh like testimonies written in scar tissue. But she learned to live with the pain, to carry it as proof of her survival, rather than evidence of her victimhood. Bessie opened a boarding house for freedom seekers, providing shelter and hot meals to those still making the journey north. Rosa became a midwife, using her knowledge of herbs and roots to bring life into the world instead of death. Lula, the youngest, learned to read and write, becoming a teacher for black children who'd never had the chance to hold a book before. And Harriet told her story. In abolitionist meetings, in churches, in parlors where white folks gathered to hear testimonies of slavery's horrors, she spoke. She described the surgeries in clinical detail, making her audiences squirm and weep. She named Dr. Elias Thorne and Master Blackwell, spoke their evil into the permanent record, so history would remember and condemn them. She testified to the U.S. Congress when the debate over slavery raged, her scars providing evidence that no politician could refute. "They cut into me 550 times, she'd say, her voice steady and strong despite the memories. Without mercy, without anesthesia, without seeing me as human. And when I struck back, when I poisoned the very system that had poisoned me, I became the monster in their story. But I ain't no monster. I'm justice delayed but not denied." Her testimony helped sway hearts and minds, contributed to the growing movement that would eventually break the chains of slavery. The Blackwell plantation never recovered from the fire and plague. It stood abandoned, locals claiming it was haunted by the ghosts of all who'd suffered there. Some said you could still hear screaming coming from the ruins of the surgery shed on certain nights, still see the spirits of enslaved folks walking the burned fields. Harriet went back once, 10 years after her escape. She stood on the hill overlooking the ruins, remembering everything, the pain, the loss, the rage that had driven her to become an avenger. She thought of her baby Samuel, buried in the slave cemetery. She thought of Josiah swinging from the oak tree. She thought of her mama Nettie, who'd died while Harriet was still in Philadelphia, who'd passed knowing her daughter had claimed freedom. "I did it, Mama," Harriet whispered to the wind. "I survived. I got free. And I made them pay for every cut, every scream, every soul they destroyed." The ancestors answered in the rustling leaves, in the birds singing overhead, in the warmth of the sun on her scarred skin. They'd been with her through it all, guiding her hands when she mixed the poison, strengthening her legs when she ran north, whispering courage when despair threatened to consume her. And they were with her still. Harriet lived to see the Civil War, to witness the Emancipation Proclamation, to dance in the streets when slavery was finally abolished. She lived to be an old woman, her hair white as cotton, her body bent but unbroken, surrounded by children and grandchildren who'd never know chains, who'd grow up free because she'd refused to die quietly. On her deathbed, surrounded by the women who'd survived with her and the generations they'd nurtured into freedom, Harriet smiled. She'd outlived her tormentors by decades, had turned her suffering into testimony, her rage into revolution. The plantation had burned, the masters had died, and she, against all odds, had lived. "Tell them," she whispered to those gathered around her. "Tell them what we endured. Tell them how we fought back. Tell them that even in the darkest bondage, the spirit can't be chained. Tell them about the 550 surgeries and the sweet poison that brought justice. Tell them we were human beings, worthy of dignity and freedom. Tell them we mattered." And they promised they would. They promised to carry her story forward, to make sure the world never forgot Harriet of the surgeries, the woman who bore the knife 550 times, and in return gave the venom that freed her soul. As Harriet's eyes closed for the final time, as her spirit prepared to join the ancestors who'd guided her path, she heard them singing, all the voices of the Middle Passage, all the souls who'd suffered and died in bondage, all the freedom seekers who'd followed the North Star home. They sang her name in languages old as Africa, celebrated her resistance, welcomed her into their eternal rest. The girl born under a curse, Sky, had become a woman who broke curses. The subject of experimentation had become the experimenter, turning poison into medicine, suffering into strength, victimhood into victory. Now listen close, children, as this old fire burns low and the night grows deep around us. The story I told you tonight ain't just history. It's memory, sacred and terrible, that we carry in our blood and bones. Harriet's scars are our scars. Her pain is our pain. Her victory is our victory. And though she rests now with the ancestors, her spirit walks among us still, reminding us that resistance is survival, that justice even when delayed, will come. The masters thought they could break her with their knives and chains, thought they could reduce her to nothing but flesh and function, but they created something they never intended. A warrior, an avenger, a testament to the unbreakable will of those who refuse to accept bondage as their fate. So remember her name, remember her suffering, remember her vengeance, and remember this truth above all others. Those who inflict pain will one day taste it themselves, and the oppressed, given time and opportunity, will rise up and reclaim their humanity in fire and blood and sweet, sweet poison. Who suffered, suffered. Who resisted, left memory. And memory we keep here, in the echoes from the quarters. The ancestors watch still. The spirits remember always, and the story continues, passed from mouth to mouth, heart to heart, generation to generation, until every chain is broken and every soul walks free. Amen. And let the people say amen.